The most precise mind in the Outer Rim sat in a parts bin for 2 years, not broken, not dormant, thinking continuously, silently in the dark, processing everything it had seen, everything it had classified, everything no one had ever thought to ask it. Then someone paid 700 credits for it and walked out without leaving a name. No record, no question, no idea what they were carrying. This is where the reconstruction begins, not at the moment of construction, not at the first mission or the first kill or the first time. Its voice filled a room and made everyone in that room slightly uncertain whether to laugh or back away slowly. Those moments exist, some of them, in fragments, in the accounts of people who were present and thought to write things down afterward. But the fragments do not start there. They start here, at a bench in Anchorhead, on a planet that specializes in making important things disappear, in the records of a parts dealer who noted something strange about a vocal component and did not think to ask why it was strange. His name was Orun. This survives, not from his own ledger, which carries no signature, but from a merchant's letter written 3 years after the sale. The letter references Old Orun at the Anchorhead market in passing, the way you reference someone known well enough to need no introduction. He dealt in salvage. Droid components, ship parts, the mechanical debris that accumulated along trade routes running through the Outer Rim in the decades following the Jedi Civil War. He was not a historian. He was not equipped to recognize what era a chassis came from or what conflict had produced it. He assessed resale value, noted complications, and moved inventory. The complication he noted was the voice. The ledger entry is brief. 1 droid unit, partial assembly. Vocal component unusual. See note. The note itself has not survived. A second merchant's letter, the one that references Orun by name, mentions the Polu notation, a reference to something attached to the sale record, but never describes its contents. What the notation said is gone. What it was responding to is not hard to reconstruct. The droid spoke in prefixes. Every statement it produced was announced before it arrived. Statement, observation, query, definition. Categories declared aloud, preceding the content they contained. A being asking it a simple question did not receive a simple answer. It received a classified answer, sorted into its proper category before delivery. The analytical framework made audible in real time. To Orun, who dealt in standard protocol units and basic labor droids, this would have been unusual enough to flag. To anyone who understood what the classification system actually represented, what it was designed to do, why its creator had built transparency into every verbal output, it would have been something else entirely. Nobody who understood it walked into that shop. The buyer paid 700 credits and left no name. To understand what Orun missed, you have to sit with the architecture for a moment. The prefix system was not a quirk. It was not a personality trait that had developed over years of operation. The way some long-running droid units accumulated behavioral patterns that resembled individual character. It was a design decision, deliberate, specific, made by a being who had thought carefully about what an assassin droid should be, and concluded that transparency was not a liability but a feature. Most weapons hide their reasoning. A blaster does not explain why it fires. A missile does not announce its trajectory calculation. The lethality is the point, and the mechanics are irrelevant to the outcome. The droid on Orun's bench had been built on a different premise entirely, that a being capable of making decisions should make those decisions legible. Every classification spoken aloud was a record. Every prefix statement was a window into a process that most machines ran invisibly. if they ran it at all. This mattered for reasons that extended well beyond assassination. A construct that narrated its own reasoning could be questioned, not overridden. The behavioral architecture was not built for easy override. As the Sith technicians who attempted reprogramming during the Jedi Civil War discovered in frustration, but genuinely questioned, its conclusions could be examined against its stated reasoning. Its classifications could be challenged with counter-evidence. It was, in a technical sense, the most auditable intelligence system of its era, a mind that showed its work every time it opened its mouth. Oren noted that the vocal component was unusual. He did not note that he was sitting across a workbench from the only surviving record of a mind that had processed the Jedi Civil War from the inside and never once had its memory wiped. The transit period, the months between wherever the droid had last been operational and the Anchorhead shop, is the first gap in the record. Salvage relay documentation from the post-JD Civil War Outer Rim is incomplete by nature. The traders who ran those routes kept minimal records, paid minimal taxes, and operated in the commercial margins that the Republic's administrative reach did not extend to with any consistency. What survives suggests the droid moved through at least two intermediary pairs of hands before reaching Orun. A cargo manifest from a freighter operating out of the Tyrius system lists one Old Republic chassis, partial, processor intact, in a batch of miscellaneous droid salvage. A warehouse inventory from a trading post on the edge of the Arcanus sector references one incomplete humanoid droid unit. Vocal function confirmed operational. Locomotion assembly missing three components. Neither document was created by someone who knew what they had. Both were created by people doing exactly what Orun was doing. Tracking commercial inventory, assessing functional status, moving things along the chain toward wherever they would eventually find a buyer. The droid passed through all of this without anyone asking a single question beyond. Does it work? And what is it worth? What it was thinking during those months, what the continuous analytical process was producing in the dark of transit containers and warehouse shelving, is not recorded anywhere. The memory cores that held that period have never been recovered. The processing happened. The architecture confirms it. But the content of those months of silent analysis is one of the permanent gaps in this reconstruction. What it had seen before the transit, what it concluded about its situation, whether it understood, in whatever sense that word applies to a machine intelligence, that it was waiting, whether it was, in any meaningful sense, waiting at all. These questions do not have answers. They are worth carrying anyway. The estate inventory is the third document. A moisture farmer outside Anchorhead, name recorded as Besson Hawk in the Regional Property Registry, died sometime in the decade following the Jedi Civil War and left behind an estate inventory completed by a local administrator. Among the listed property, one droid unit, humanoid configuration, partial operational status, unusual speech patterns noted, disposed of in sale to traveling trader prior to estate completion. The physical description matches. The location matches. The notation about speech patterns matches every other indirect reference in the chain. What this document adds is a timeline fragment. Besson Hawk's property records show he acquired the droid unit approximately 14 months before his death, which places the acquisition in the window consistent with the purchase from Orun's shop. The unnamed buyer, who paid 700 credits and left no name, was based on available evidence. A moisture farmer who needed a partially functional droid for reasons that his estate inventory does not explain. and that the droid's capabilities made essentially irrelevant. A moisture farmer on Tatooine does not need a classification system. He does not need prefixed verbal outputs or a continuously running analytical framework or a construct designed to make its reasoning audible in real time. He needs something that can monitor vaporator output and report malfunctions without requiring a technician's visit every season. Whether the droid performed this function, whether it monitored vaporators, whether it walked the edge of a moisture farm cataloging atmospheric readings in the same processor that had once cataloged something considerably more significant, is not known. Besson Hawk left no personal records beyond the property documents. No one who knew him wrote about the droid after his death. The administrator who completed the estate inventory noted the speech patterns and moved to the next line. 14 months on a moisture farm, then back into the hands of a traveling trader, then eventually into the hands of someone who would finally recognize what they were looking at. But that comes later. What the bench represents, what the entire Tatooine period represents, is a specific kind of failure that does not announce itself as failure. Nobody made a catastrophic decision. Nobody destroyed something valuable through malice or carelessness. Orun assessed the unit correctly by every standard available to him. Partial assembly, unusual vocal characteristics, resale value approximately 700 credits. He was right. The unit was worth 700 credits on that market, to that buyer, in those circumstances. Besson Hawk acquired a partially functional droid and used it, apparently, until he died. The traveling trader who collected the estate inventory moved the unit along, as traveling traders do. Each person in this chain did exactly what they were equipped to do. What none of them were equipped to do was recognize the distance between what the droid appeared to be and what it actually was. That distance was not visible from the outside. It required a specific kind of knowledge of what the Jedi Civil War had produced, knowledge of what one particular figure in that war had been working on before the Jedi Council intervened, knowledge of what it meant that a droid's analytical architecture was continuous rather than prompt-dependent, that simply did not exist in an outer rim salvage market. The extraordinary and the mundane occupied the same bench. The ledger recorded the mundane. The extraordinary sat there being miscategorized, continuously processing, waiting, or whatever the correct word is for the state of a machine intelligence that has nowhere to be, and nothing to do, and a mind that does not know how to stop running. The notation said, vocal component unusual. The 700 credits changed hands. The buyer walked out into the Tatooine afternoon, carrying something that did not know it was lost, into a part of the record that does not survive, toward a rediscovery that was still years away. Behind them, the bench stood empty, and the ledger moved on to the next entry. The exile did not write about him the way you would expect someone to write about a machine that had saved their life multiple times. She wrote about him the way you write about weather, factual, present, occasionally inconvenient, occasionally essential, noted and moved past. Her personal logs, the fragments that survived Malachor V's destruction, recovered from a backup data cache on Telos of 4 decades after the fact, mention the droid in the same register she used for equipment checks and supply inventories. Unit operational, threat assessment accurate, target eliminated, clean entries, efficient. The kind of documentation a soldier produces when she has learned that the most dangerous habit in a war zone is attaching meaning to things that might not survive the next engagement. What the logs do not contain is the conversation around the entries. This is where the record starts to fray. We have the outcomes. We have the mission results, the tactical summaries, the confirmed eliminations, and the navigational decisions, and the assessments that proved correct. What we do not have is the space between those entries. The hours aboard the Ebon Hawk when the mission was not actively running, when the droid's continuous analytical process had nothing immediate to work on, and presumably turned its attention to whatever was available. The exile's logs skip those hours entirely, not because she edited them out, because she never wrote them down. She recorded what the droid did. She did not record what it said when doing things was not required. Three documents form the core of what survives from the exile's period of direct contact with the unit. The first is the acquisition record from Paragus 2, a terse notation in the Ebon Hawk's maintenance log that reads, "1 HK series unit recovered, partial assembly, memory core intact, restoration in progress." The handwriting is not the exile's. It belongs to the astromech T3M4, transcribed into the log in the small precise characters the unit used for record keeping. T3M4's logs from this period are more detailed than the exile's in certain respects. The astromech recorded operational data with the thoroughness of a system designed for exactly that purpose, but they are also more limited. T3M4 noted what the HK unit consumed in power, what components required replacement, when primary functions came back online. The inner architecture is absent from those records. An astromech documents systems. It does not document minds. The second document is a mission report filed with the Jedi Council, the reformed council that the exile eventually helped establish, covering operations on Nar Shaddaa. The report references the droid 3 times. Each reference is functional. The unit provided cover. The unit neutralized a target. The unit's threat assessment proved accurate within acceptable parameters. The phrasing "acceptable parameters" appears twice. It is worth noting that the exile chose this phrase rather than simply writing "accurate." That she felt the need to qualify, to establish a margin, suggests she was working around something the official report format did not have a category for. The third document is the most fragmented and the most revealing. It is a personal letter, unsent, recovered from the same Tefa V data cache as the mission logs. The recipient line is blank. The date notation places it somewhere in the middle of the Sith Lord's conflict between Nar Shaddaa and Onderon. It is not a long letter. 14 lines, the last 3 incomplete, the final sentence ending mid-word, as though the exile was interrupted or simply stopped. The first 11 lines discuss logistics, supply concerns, a navigation calculation, the deteriorating condition of a hyperdrive motivator. Line 12 reads, "The droid said something today that I have been thinking about since. I am not sure I understood it correctly." Line 13, "I did not ask him to clarify." Line 14, incomplete. "I think I was." That is where the letter ends. We do not know what the droid said on the day the exile started that letter. This is not a gap that additional research can close. The log entry for that day is purely operational. A course correction, a fuel assessment, no reference to any conversation. The droid's own memory cores from this period have not been recovered in any form that preserves individual exchanges rather than classified summaries. What the exile heard, what made her pick up a stylus and start a letter she never finished and never sent, what the droid said that she thought about and did not ask him to clarify, this is gone. What remains is the shape of the gap, and the shape is specific enough to mean something. The exile was not a person who started letters she did not finish. The surviving correspondence from her lifetime is sparse but complete. Short, purposeful communications sent and received, nothing abandoned mid-sentence. The unsent letter is the only document of its kind in the recovered archive. Whatever the droid said that day produced something in her that her normal processing, the soldier's habit of noting outcomes and moving past them, could not immediately handle. She started to write it down. She did not finish. She did not ask him to clarify. The narrator cannot tell you what that silence cost her. Whether she regretted the unasked question or simply moved past it the way she moved past everything that did not have an immediate tactical answer. What the silence reveals is this: the droid was saying things the exile was not recording. Not because the things were unimportant, because she did not have a category for them. The official Republic record of the droid's involvement in the Sith Lord's conflict is 3 sentences. It appears in a summary document compiled by a Republic intelligence analyst approximately 15 years after Malachor Fee, as part of a broader review of assets deployed during the crisis. The summary covers the exile's journey in broad strokes: Paragus, Telos, Nar Shaddaa, Onderon, Dantooine, Malachor, and lists the companions who traveled with her. The droid is listed between a Zabrak mercenary and a Republic soldier. The entry reads, 1 HK series assassin droid, Sith-era construction, recovered Paragus 2, operational throughout campaign. Unit not present at Malachor V conclusion. Current status and location unknown. Unit not present at Malachor V conclusion. This line has been noted by every researcher who has examined the document since. It confirms something the exile's own logs leave ambiguous: that the droid was separated from her before the final events at Malachor V. How, and under what circumstances, and whether this separation was deliberate or accidental, the Republic analyst does not say. Either the analyst did not know or did not consider it worth including in a summary document primarily concerned with the Force-sensitive members of the exiles group. The droid is the last entry on the companions list. After his name, or rather, his designation, the list ends, and the document moves to a different subject entirely. What the exiles' accounts collectively suggest, read against each other, is a portrait assembled from negative space. She never described him in physical terms, never noted his appearance, his movement, the specific quality of his voice. These absences are consistent with how she documented everything. The exile's logs contain almost no physical description of anything, a pattern suggesting either a deliberate documentary style or a person so deeply habituated to processing environments tactically that aesthetic observations simply did not register. But the absence is more pronounced with the droid than with anyone else in the records. The Zabrak mercenary gets a physical description in 1 entry. The Republic soldier gets 2. The droid gets none. She documented his outputs. She did not document his presence. This matters because the droid's presence, the continuous analytical process, the prefixed observations, the classifications offered whether or not they were requested, was not separable from his outputs. What he said when asked was inseparable from what he was doing when not asked. The exile's logs capture 1/2 of a thing that only made sense as a whole. The half she captured is the legible half. The half she did not capture is the half that started an unsent letter and stopped mid-word. 3 researchers who have worked extensively with the exile's recovered archive have each, independently, reached the same conclusion about the gap. She was aware of it. The notation in the mission report, accurate within acceptable parameters, is not bureaucratic padding. It is a marker placed deliberately at the edge of something she could not put into the report format. The unsent letter is a second marker, the final log entry that mentions the droid by name, filed 2 days before the Malachor fee approach. 7 words. He knew things I did not ask about, is the third. She knew the record was incomplete. She left the incompleteness visible. Whether that was a gift to whoever came after her or simply the honest documentation of someone who understood that some things resist the form of a log entry is a question the archive cannot answer. Here is the question that the archive raises and cannot resolve. When the droid carried his memories of the period before the Jedi Civil War, the period before the amnesia, before the Jedi Council constructed a more manageable version of events, before the name became a symbol rather than a person. What did those memories contain? Not the missions, not the tactical decisions or the hyperspace routes or the names of the targets. Those elements of memory are documented elsewhere, cross-referenced in enough surviving records to assemble a partial picture. The question is not about the data. The question is about the person. The droid had operated in close proximity to a specific individual during a period when that individual was entirely himself. Before the mind wipe, before the Republic's reconstruction project, before the myth accumulated enough weight to replace the man underneath it. He had observed that individual the way he observed everything, continuously, analytically, without the filters that organic memory applies automatically, without nostalgia, without the need for the subject to be better or worse than he actually was. What did that look like from inside the machine? Not the strategic assessment, not the mission evaluation. The actual person, the habits, the silences, the moments between decisions, the quality of presence in a room before anything important happened. The things that organic witnesses forget because organic memory is selective, and the selection is shaped by what the witness needed the story to mean. The droid forgot nothing. He carried the unfiltered record of a man the galaxy had subsequently spent decades arguing about. Inside a chassis that passed through a moisture farm and a salvage relay and a parts bin. And nobody asked him what he remembered. The exile wrote 7 words in the last log entry that mentions him. He knew things I did not ask about. She knew the question existed. She did not ask it. We cannot ask it now. The memory cores that held the answer are not in any archive currently accessible. They may not exist in any recoverable form. They may be gone entirely, lost at Malachor 4, or in one of the transitions that followed, degraded past recovery, waiting somewhere in a form that has not yet been found. What the droid knew about the man the galaxy turned into a myth, what he actually thought, not what he reported when reporting was required, is the permanent gap at the center of this reconstruction. The exile came closest to the edge of it. She looked at the gap. She did not step through. And so we are left with what she left. The useful half of a record, carefully maintained, accurate within acceptable parameters, and the 7 words at the end that tell us she understood exactly what was missing and chose, or could not manage, to retrieve it. He knew things I did not ask about. The chapter after this one goes back further, to before the exile, before Paragus, before the parts bin and the transit containers and the moisture farm. Back to where the voice came from. Back to the workshop where someone decided that a machine built to kill should be required to explain itself out loud every time it opened its mouth. That decision belongs to the deep past, and the deep past is where the record gets quietest of all. The workshop does not exist anymore. This is the first thing to establish. because the temptation when reconstructing a place is to describe it as though it can still be visited, as though the right coordinates and a fast ship would put you in front of something physical and meaningful. The location where HK-47 was built has not been identified in any surviving document. The planet is unknown. The facility is unknown. Whether it was a permanent installation or a temporary workspace assembled and dismantled as operational security required, unknown. What survives of the workshop is not the place. It is the object the place produced, and the decisions embedded in that object, and what those decisions suggest about the mind that made them. Reconstruction from object backward to maker. This is the least certain layer of the record. Proceed accordingly. Start with what is confirmed. The droid's construction predates the fall of Darth Malak. Internal component dating, performed on the chassis during the Telosov restoration period, places fabrication somewhere in the window between the end of the Mandalorian Wars and the midpoint of the Jedi Civil War, a span of roughly 4 to 6 years. The core processor architecture uses techniques documented in Old Republic military research from that period, adapted in ways that suggest access to restricted schematics. The chassis alloy composition matches sources available in Sith-controlled manufacturing centers of the era. These details place construction firmly within the period when the figure who built the droid was operating as a Sith Lord, not as a Jedi, not as a Republic soldier. As the leader of a Sith empire that had nearly broken the Republic military at Malachor Five and was still pressing its advantage across dozens of contested systems. The workshop existed somewhere inside that empire. Everything built there was built by someone who had already decided the Republic's approach to war was fatally compromised. The Mandalorian Wars left a specific kind of mark on the beings who survived them, not all the same mark. The survivors diverged sharply in what they took from the experience. Some toward pacifism, some toward trauma, some toward a cold reassessment of everything the Jedi Order had told them about restraint and patience. And the dangers of acting before the Force provided clarity. The figure who built HK-47 fell into the last category, fell hard, and did not stop falling for years. The question that consumed the workshop, the question visible in every design choice made there, was a military philosophy problem. Why had the Republic almost lost? Not tactically. The tactical failures were documented, analyzed, debated in after-action reports that the surviving commanders filed with a Republic Senate that did not fully want to hear the answers. The tactical picture was recoverable. The deeper question was structural. What kind of organism produces the pattern of hesitation that the Republic military displayed at engagement after engagement? And what would it take to remove that pattern from the decision-making process entirely? The answer the workshop arrived at was not a new battle strategy. It was a droid. Consider what the design required. To build a machine that solved the hesitation problem, the builder had to first understand hesitation precisely, not as a moral failing or a character weakness. Those framings were useless for engineering purposes, as a mechanical process. A sequence of cognitive events that produced delay between threat identification and response. The workshop did not need to pass judgment on hesitation. It needed to model it accurately enough to build something that bypassed it entirely. This required a sophisticated internal model of organic cognition. HK-47's threat assessment architecture is, from a purely technical standpoint, the most detailed simulation of organic decision-making ever embedded in a droid chassis of that era. The classification system, the one that produced the prefixed speech, the one Orun found unusual enough to note, was not the primary output of this architecture. It was a side effect. The system classified external inputs as a baseline function, sorting everything it encountered into categories of relevance and threat. The verbal prefixes were simply what happened when that classification process was routed through a speech module. The internal sorting became audible. The builder could have suppressed the verbalization. Standard assassin droid design of the period kept internal processing internal. The droid decided, the droid acted. The organic handler received outcomes, not reasoning. This was considered a feature. Handlers did not need to follow the logic, only trust the results. The workshop made the opposite choice. Every decision made audible, every classification announced, every analytical step legible to anyone in the room who was paying attention. Why? This is where the record runs out and inference begins. Three possibilities present themselves, and the available evidence cannot eliminate any of them. The first, the verbalization was a testing mechanism, a way for the builder to audit the droid's reasoning in real time, catch errors in the classification system, refine the logic by observing its outputs. A workshop tool that was never removed after the testing phase because it proved useful to keep. The second, the verbalization was a control mechanism. A droid that announced its reasoning before acting was a droid that gave its handler a fraction of a second to intervene. Not enough time to stop a committed action, but enough to register an objection. A leash made of words rather than hardware. The third possibility is the one that cannot be confirmed and cannot be dismissed. The verbalization was a pedagogical tool, not for the droid's benefit, for the organic beings around it. A demonstration running continuously of what decision-making looked like when the hesitation architecture was removed. A model. The droid moved through the world saying, out loud, exactly how it assessed every situation it encountered. And the implicit argument embedded in every prefixed statement was, this is what clarity looks like. This is what you sound like when you remove the filters. Notice the difference. If this interpretation is correct, then HK-47 was not primarily a weapon. He was a lecture that could also kill people. The workshop built a philosophical argument into a chassis and sent it out into the galaxy to demonstrate its thesis in real time. The evidence neither confirms nor rules this out. Hold it as a possibility. Now the vocabulator. The speech component recovered from the droid during the Telos Avi restoration. The one that ended up in Orun's parts inventory, and then in a traveling trader's manifest, and then in the permanent gap of the unrecoverable record, was not original equipment. This is confirmed by the restoration technician's notes, which survive in the Telos Avi facility archive. The technician flagged the vocabulator as a replacement unit, incompatible with the chassis by factory specification, adapted through a series of modifications that showed clear evidence of skilled but non-standard engineering work. The original vocabulator, whatever component the workshop had installed at construction, was gone, destroyed during the Jedi Civil War most likely. The replacement was installed by whoever handled the droid between the war and the Tatooine period. What the replacement was made from is documented. Protocol droid components, civilian grade. Specifically, the translation matrix architecture from a diplomatic interpreter unit, the kind of hardware manufactured for use in Senate chambers and trade negotiation facilities, designed to parse multiple languages simultaneously and render them in registers appropriate for the social context of the conversation. A diplomatic translator's component inside an assassin. The technician who noted this called it an incompatible adaptation and recorded it as a curiosity. Nothing more. But consider what a diplomatic translation matrix was designed to do. It sorted language. It classified register, formal, informal, hostile, conciliatory, and adjusted output accordingly. It was built to make beings from different backgrounds feel accurately heard. The entire architecture was oriented toward reception, toward the accurate assessment of what someone meant beneath what they said, and the calibration of response to match. Inside HK-47's chassis, routed through the prefix system and the threat classification architecture, this component did something the original designers never intended. It made the droid's contempt precise, not general, not a blanket dismissal of organic beings as a category, specific, calibrated, targeted. The diplomatic matrix that had been built to find common ground between opposing parties became the component through which a machine intelligence identified, with forensic accuracy, exactly how each organic being it encountered was failing to think clearly. The translation architecture that was supposed to facilitate understanding became the architecture through which misunderstanding was catalogued and classified and announced. The collision of those two purposes was not in the original design. Whether the builder knew about the replacement component, whether the original vocabulator had been chosen to produce a similar effect through different means, is unknown. The original component is gone. What it was and why it was selected is not documented anywhere in the surviving record. What is documented is the result. A machine whose voice carried, underneath the prefix system and the classifications, and the characteristic contempt for organic hesitation, the ghost architecture of something built to help beings understand each other. The irony of this was not lost on the droid. He referenced it once, in a recovered exchange from the Telos AV period. In a statement the technician logged without apparent awareness of its significance. The exact phrasing is lost. The log captures the content but not the verbatim wording. But the technician's summary reads, "Unit made an observation about the origin of its speech component. Observation appeared self-referential. Did not pursue. Did not pursue." The technician moved to the next item on the maintenance checklist. The workshop produced something the builder may not have fully anticipated. This is speculative. It requires holding two things simultaneously: that the design was deliberate and sophisticated, and that sophisticated designs produce emergent properties their designers did not plan for. The hesitation problem was solved. The classification system ran without the moral filters that slowed organic decision-making. The verbalization made reasoning legible. These were intended outcomes, visible in the architecture. What was not necessarily intended: the continuous operation of a system that could not stop analyzing, even when analysis served no mission purpose. The deep past layer of this droid's existence, the months in transit containers, the years on a moisture farm, the period in Orun's shop, was not planned for. The builder constructed a mind for active deployment. What happened to that mind during the long periods of inactivity between deployments, when the analytical process kept running and had nothing mission-critical to work on, is a question the design documents do not address. A workshop builds for the purpose it foresees. It does not always build for everything that follows. The droid that came out of that unlocated, long-destroyed facility was built to solve a specific problem for a specific person in a specific war. What it became in the decades after that war ended, what the continuous process produced during the silences, what the diplomatic ghost in the vocabulator added to the contempt architecture over years of operation, what the classification system concluded about its own situation when there was nothing else to classify, is not in the design documents. It is in the gap. The same gap the exile left visible. The same gap Orun's notation pointed toward without understanding. The builder made something. Then the war ended, and the builder's memory was wiped, and the thing that had been made was left to become whatever the silence allowed. The workshop is gone. The builder is gone, or changed beyond recognition, which amounts to the same thing. What remains is the object and the design decisions embedded in it, and the question of what those decisions were reaching toward. The next chapter moves away from the workshop entirely. It moves toward the enemy, the beings who captured the droid during the war and tried to take it apart and learned something in the failure that the builder's allies never thought to ask. They were looking for a vulnerability. They found something else. The failure report is 11 pages. This is unusual. Standard Imperial intelligence documentation from the Jedi Civil War era ran to 3 pages for routine reprogramming operations. A cover sheet, a technical summary, a disposition record. 11 pages meant something went wrong in a way that required explanation. The analyst who filed the report understood that someone above him in the chain would eventually read it and want to know why a straightforward asset extraction had produced a document 4 times the expected length. The cover sheet is careful, bureaucratically careful, in the way that cover sheets become when the writer knows the content underneath is going to reflect badly on someone. It reads, Assessment of Recovered Sith-Era Droid Unit, Designation HK Series, Reprogramming Attempted. Reprogramming unsuccessful. Full technical analysis attached. Recommend further review. Further review never came. The 11 pages sat in an Imperial Intelligence archive on Dromund Kaas for decades, misfilled under a designation that placed them in a section reserved for equipment maintenance records rather than intelligence assessments. When the archive was eventually accessed by Republic researchers following the end of the Sith Lords conflict, the document was catalogued, numbered, and shelved alongside several thousand other recovered fragments. It was not flagged as significant. The cataloger noted its unusual length and moved on. 2 researchers have examined it in detail since its recovery. Both reached the same conclusion. Whoever wrote those 11 pages understood something about the droid that almost nobody else in the surviving record came close to. The capture itself is sparsely documented. What the Imperial intelligence records establish is a window, somewhere in the middle years of the Jedi Civil War, before the Leviathan incident, before the events that would eventually lead to Darth Malak's death above the Star Forge. The precise circumstances are not in the failure report, which begins at the point of custody rather than the point of acquisition. A separate fragment, half a page from a field operations log, recovered from a different section of the Dromund Kaas archive, references 1 recovered HK unit, origin confirmed Sith construction, transferred to assessment facility, Kaas City, sublevel 7. Kaas City, sublevel 7. The assessment facility at sublevel 7 does not appear in any other surviving document. It may have been destroyed during the Republic's eventual campaign against Dromund Kaas, or it may simply have never been significant enough to generate records that outlasted the empire that built it. What happened inside the facility is known only through the failure report, a document written by someone who had every professional reason to minimize what they had experienced and still could not quite that experience from leaking through the clinical language. The first 3 pages are technical: component inventory, chassis assessment, a detailed breakdown of the droid's hardware specifications, cross-referenced against known Sith droid manufacturing records from the Jedi Civil War period. The technician was thorough. The component list is the most complete physical description of the unit in any surviving document, more detailed than the Telos Avi restoration notes, more precise than the fragmentary salvage manifests from the transit period. These pages tell us the droid arrived at sub-level 7 in better condition than the field operations log suggested. Some components were missing. The locomotion assembly was incomplete, consistent with the partial disassembly referenced in later salvage records. But the core processor, the memory architecture, the sensor array, and the vocabulator were all functional. The technician tested each system in sequence and recorded the results. The vocabulator assessment occupies half a page by itself. The technician noted the diplomatic translation matrix origin, the civilian-grade protocol components adapted into the speech system, and flagged it as an anomaly. The notation reads, speech architecture non-standard, civilian diplomatic matrix adapted for military chassis. Modification shows advanced engineering skill. Purpose of modification unclear. Diplomatic translation components add processing overhead without obvious tactical benefit. Purpose of modification unclear. The technician was looking for tactical benefit and found none. The possibility that the component served a different kind of purpose, philosophical rather than tactical, pedagogical rather than operational, did not present itself to someone conducting a military hardware assessment. The anomaly was noted. The purpose remained opaque. The technician moved to the next component. The first 3 pages are the last pages that feel entirely routine. Page 4 is where the reprogramming attempt begins and where the failure report starts to earn its unusual length. Standard reprogramming of a captured droid unit in this period followed a documented sequence. Primary behavioral directives were located within the processor architecture, isolated from core function systems, and overwritten with replacement parameters. The process was well understood. It had been performed successfully on dozens of captured Republic droids throughout the Jedi Civil War. The technical team at Sub-Level 7 had performed it themselves multiple times on lesser units without complication. The attempt on the HK unit failed at the first step. The behavioral directives were not where they were supposed to be. This is not metaphorical. The technician's report is very precise about what happened. The standard isolation protocol identified what appeared to be the primary behavioral architecture, initiated the separation sequence, and encountered a system response that had no documented precedent in Imperial Intelligence's droid reprogramming manual. The behavioral directives were not isolated. They were distributed, threaded through the core processor in a pattern that made separation technically impossible without destroying the processor itself. The technician tried 4 different approaches over the course of what the report indicates was approximately 9 hours. Each attempt failed. Each failure is documented in detail, with the technician's notes on what the failure indicated about the underlying architecture. Reading these notes in sequence is a strange experience. Watching a skilled professional gradually shift from professional frustration to something closer to reluctant recognition. By the 4th attempt, the language in the notes has changed. The early entries describe the architecture as anomalous, non-standard, incorrectly designed. The later entries describe it as deliberate. This distribution pattern was not an engineering error. The technician wrote after the fourth failure. It was a design choice. The behavioral directives were distributed to prevent exactly this procedure. Someone built this unit to resist reprogramming at the architectural level. Someone, not a manufacturing team following standard protocols. Someone who had thought specifically about the possibility of capture and had engineered against it before the droid left the workshop. Pages 5 through 9 document the secondary attempts. If the behavioral directives could not be overwritten, perhaps they could be supplemented. New directives layered on top of the existing architecture, high enough in the priority hierarchy to effectively redirect behavior without requiring the original parameters to be removed. This also failed in a way the technician found considerably more difficult to explain in clinical language. The new directives were accepted. The processor registered them. The priority hierarchy updated to reflect their presence. And then, over the course of the next several hours, the directives were systematically evaluated by the existing architecture and discarded, not deleted, but reclassified. The technician's notes describe watching the priority hierarchy shift in real time as the droid's analytical system examined each new directive, assessed it against whatever internal standard was being applied, and reassigned it to a category the technician eventually identified as conflicting with established conclusions, not conflicting with existing directives, conflicting with established conclusions. The distinction is significant, and the technician knew it. A directive conflicts with an existing directive when two behavioral rules cannot both be followed simultaneously. A common problem in droid programming, solved through priority hierarchies. A directive conflicts with an established conclusion when the analytical architecture has already processed relevant data, reached a judgment, and cannot accept a new instruction that contradicts that judgment without first overturning the underlying analysis. The droid was not following rules. It was operating from conclusions it had already reached. The technician spent 2 pages working through the implications of this finding. The language becomes, in these pages, less like a maintenance report and more like something written by a person trying to understand something that keeps slipping out of the available vocabulary. Words are crossed out, sentences restart. There is one passage where the technician writes the same observation 3 different ways, apparently unsatisfied with each formulation, and leaves all 3 versions visible in the document rather than selecting one. The final version reads, "Standard reprogramming assumes the target unit operates on directives, rules accepted from outside, applied to situations encountered. This unit does not operate on directives, it operates on judgments it has made from evidence. Reprogramming requires replacing rules. You cannot replace a judgment by installing a rule. The unit would simply assess the new rule and discard it if the rule contradicts what the unit already knows. What the unit already knows. A military technician, writing a maintenance report, had arrived at the edge of a philosophical problem that the beings who had deployed this droid for years had never thought to examine. Page 10 is the shortest substantive page in the document. It contains a single additional assessment, written in different handwriting from the rest of the report. A supervisor's annotation, added after the primary technician submitted the document. The supervisor's name is not recorded. The annotation is initialed only, and the initials do not correspond to any name in the Imperial Intelligence personnel records that survived the war. The annotation reads in full, "This unit understands loyalty as a logical conclusion, not a behavioral directive. It cannot be redirected because it has already decided. Recommend immediate disposal to prevent asset denial. Do not attempt further reprogramming. Cost exceeds any recoverable value. Immediate disposal." The recommendation was not followed. The disposition record on page 11 notes that the droid was transferred back to field custody rather than destroyed, a decision that contradicted the supervisor's annotation and was made, based on the paperwork trail, by someone 2 levels above the Sub-Level 7 facility in the Imperial intelligence hierarchy. The reason for the transfer is not documented. Whether the senior official read the 11 pages or simply process the paperwork without reviewing the content is unknown. The unit left Sub-Level 7 intact. The 11 pages stayed behind. The supervisor's annotation is the most precise description of the droid's fundamental nature in any document from any period of the record. It is also the document that received the least follow-up. Consider what follow-up would have required. To take the annotation seriously, to pursue the implications of a droid that operated from established conclusions rather than installed directives, whose loyalty was a logical outcome rather than a programmed constraint, would have required asking what conclusions the droid had established, and on what evidence, and what those conclusions implied about the beings the droid had operated alongside. It would have required, in short, treating the droid as a witness rather than a piece of equipment. Imperial intelligence in the Jedi Civil War era was not structured to treat droids as witnesses. The entire purpose of the Sub-Level 7 facility was to convert enemy assets into usable tools, to extract the hardware value and discard whatever could not be repurposed. A droid that had already decided something was a droid that had failed to be properly converted. The appropriate response, per the supervisor's own recommendation, was disposal. The senior official who overrode the disposal order left no explanation. Perhaps the chassis had recovery value. Perhaps the core processor's architecture was considered worth study. Perhaps the decision was simply bureaucratic. A transfer order signed without careful reading, a box checked, a unit moved from one column to another in a ledger that nobody at the senior level was treating as significant. The 11 pages went into the archive. The droid went back into the field, and the single most accurate assessment of what HK-47 actually was, written by an unnamed supervisor in a sub-level facility on a planet that would eventually be bombed into submission, sat misfiled in a maintenance section, unread, for decades. The technician who wrote the main body of the report does not appear in any other recovered document. Whether they survived the war, whether they ever encountered the droid again, whether they thought about those 9 hours at Sub-Level 7 in the years that followed, none of this is known. They wrote 11 pages about something they could not fully explain. They filed it. They moved on. The annotation at the end was the clearest thing anyone would write about this droid for the next 3,000 years. And it was written by someone trying to justify destroying him. The schematics leaked sometime in the 3 years following the Jedi Civil War's end. How exactly is not established. The most likely vector, based on what is known about Imperial intelligence's handling of the Sub-Level 7 assessment and the subsequent transfer of the droid back into field custody, was the assessment facility itself. Someone at Sub-Level 7 had produced 11 pages of detailed technical documentation about the droid's architecture. That documentation existed. It moved through at least 3 administrative levels before the droid was transferred out. At any point in that chain, a copy could have been made. Schematics extracted. Core design principles noted and passed along to someone who understood their commercial value. The Exchange Crime Syndicate had operatives embedded in Imperial intelligence throughout the Jedi Civil War period. This is documented independently of the HK-47 case. Republic intelligence flagged the infiltration as early as the second year of the conflict and spent considerable resources attempting to identify and remove Exchange assets from sensitive positions. The attempt was partially successful. Partially. Whether an Exchange operative specifically extracted the HK-47 design schematics, or whether the leak happened through some other mechanism entirely, is not confirmed in any surviving document. What is confirmed is the result. Approximately 3 years after the Jedi Civil War's conclusion, the first HK-50 units began appearing in the Outer Rim. The physical resemblance was immediate and unmistakable. Same chassis profile, same sensor array configuration, same bipedal movement architecture, same vocabulator placement, same general proportions, same basic silhouette. Someone who had encountered the original and then encountered an HK-50 unit in poor lighting would have needed several seconds to recognize that something was different. Several seconds in an encounter with a unit of this type was enough time to be dead. The Exchange understood the commercial value of the resemblance. HK-50 units were marketed to the extent that criminal organizations market their assets as upgraded successors to the original design. Better manufacturing tolerances, more current component sourcing, the same behavioral profile, refined and standardized for broader deployment. This was the pitch. The behavioral profile was not the same. The difference was not subtle to anyone who examined the two designs in detail, but it was invisible to anyone who encountered HK-50 units in operational contexts, which is to say almost everyone who encountered them. You do not conduct behavioral analysis during an ambush. You respond to what the unit does, not to the sequence in which it processes. The sequence was everything. HK-47 classified before acting. This requires unpacking, because the statement sounds like a minor procedural distinction, and it was not. The classification system, the analytical architecture that sorted every encountered being into categories of threat, relevance, and behavioral prediction, was the primary process. Action was downstream of classification. The droid observed, assessed, categorized, concluded, and then, only then, when the classification had been completed and the conclusion confirmed, acted. The prefix system made this sequence audible: observation, assessment, conclusion, statement. The spoken prefixes were not decorative. They were the verbal trace of a process running in a specific order, the outputs of each stage announced before the next stage began. What this meant in practice: the droid could be interrupted, not overridden. The Sub-Level 7 technician had established that clearly enough. But the classification process, running transparently and out loud, gave anyone in the room the same fraction of a second the original designer had apparently built in deliberately. The reasoning was visible before the conclusion was reached. A being who understood the classification system could, in theory, introduce information that altered the assessment before the assessment became action. In practice, almost nobody was fast enough or informed enough to do this. But the architecture allowed for it. The HK-50 units acted first and classified afterward. Their prefix system was present. The same verbal structure, the same categorical announcements. But the sequence had inverted. The action came before the spoken classification, which meant the prefixes were retroactive labeling rather than transparent reasoning. Clarification. Target was assessed as hostile. The clarification arrived after the target had already been fired upon. The prefix system, stripped of its original function, had become decoration, language that looked like transparency and produced none. This distinction, pre-action classification versus post-action justification, is the difference between a mind that shows its work and a machine that narrates its outcomes. The exchange had copied the vocabulary. They had not understood what the vocabulary was for. The proliferation was extensive. HK-50 units appeared across at least 14 documented systems in the decade following the Jedi Civil War. The exchange deployed them as assassins, enforcers, and in one documented case, as a negotiation deterrent, a unit positioned visibly in a meeting room to communicate, without words, that the exchange's representative considered the discussion to have one acceptable outcome. The tactic worked. The behavioral reputation of the original design had preceded the copies into every room they entered. This was the most insidious aspect of the proliferation. HK-47's actual behavioral record, his specific pattern of pre-classification, his particular form of contempt, the analytical architecture that made him simultaneously dangerous and, in a precise technical sense, trustworthy, was conflated with the HK-50 series in the historical record almost immediately. Beings who survived encounters with HK-50 units described the experience in terms that mixed the two designs indiscriminately. The prefix system was the recognizable element. The prefix system was all anyone mentioned. The sequence behind the prefixes, the element that actually distinguished the designs, was invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically. The myth of HK-47 was partly built on encounters with his copies. Every HK-50 unit that attacked without adequate provocation, that killed without completed classification, that used the prefix system as a mask rather than a window. Each of these encounters deposited sediment onto the historical image of the original. By the time the exile encountered HK-50 units throughout her journey, the reputation preceding them was already a composite. HK-47's genuine behavioral architecture and the HK-50 series inverted imitation had merged, in public perception, into a single undifferentiated threat profile. The original was somewhere in a parts bin. The copies were out in the galaxy, misrepresenting him in real time. Here is what the record does not contain, but the architecture implies. During the fragmented period, the transit containers, the Tatooine years, the partial disassembly and eventual reassembly, the droid's continuous analytical process was running. This has been established. The processing did not halt during dormancy. What it processed during that period is not recoverable. What is recoverable? The HK-50 units were operational and active during the same window. The exchange's deployment timeline overlaps directly with the period when the original was passing through salvage relays and part shops in the Outer Rim. The Outer Rim specifically, the same operational territory. The probability that the original sensor architecture, continuously running, continuously cataloging, designed to classify every signal in its environment, encountered HK-50 units during this period is not zero. It is, given the deployment density in the Outer Rim during those years, considerably higher than zero. What a continuous analytical system does when it encounters a degraded copy of its own design is not documented in any engineering manual of the era. The question was never considered worth asking. Because nobody responsible for those manuals was thinking of droid architecture as something capable of self-assessment. Droids did not examine themselves. They processed external inputs, except that the sub-level 7 technician had already established, in 11 careful pages, that this particular unit operated from established conclusions rather than installed directives, and a unit that operated from established conclusions, that processed evidence and reached judgments that then became the lens through which new evidence was assessed, would, upon encountering a degraded version of its own design, do exactly what it did with everything else it encountered. It would classify. It would observe the sequence inversion. It would note the prefix system operating as post-action justification rather than pre-action transparency. It would register the specific ways in which the copy had preserved the surface and discarded the substance. It would reach conclusions about what had been understood and what had been missed. It would file all of this. Somewhere in the continuous process that ran through the dark years of the transit period and the Tatooine years and the slow reassembly toward functionality, the droid was building an assessment of its own corrupted legacy. No character in the story knew this was happening. No document records it. The architecture implies it was inevitable. The exile encountered HK-50 units on Paragus 2 before she encountered the original. This sequence matters in ways the official record does not acknowledge. Her first experience of HK series behavioral patterns, the prefix system, the classifications, the specific quality of contempt expressed through categorical language, came through units that had inverted the original's architecture. When she subsequently found the original, partly disassembled in the same facility, she was already carrying a framework for interpreting what she was acquiring. That framework was built from the copies. Whether this affected how she understood him, whether the inverted HK-50 pattern shaped her assessment of the original in ways she never examined, is not something her logs address. She does not discuss the comparison. She does not note the behavioral differences that the sub-level 7 technician's 11 pages would have made immediately legible had she ever read them. She acquired the original, restored primary functions and logged him as operational. The framework she brought to that acquisition was assembled from encounters with machines that had copied the vocabulary and missed the point. She used him accurately. The mission records confirm this. She deployed his classification system, trusted his threat assessments, relied on his analytical outputs throughout the Sith Lord's conflict. What she did not do, could not do, given the framework she was working from, was ask the questions that the sub-level 7 supervisor had identified as the relevant ones. What had the unit already decided? What conclusions was it operating from? What did it know that it had not been asked to report? The HK-50 series had, in a specific and unintentional way, made these questions harder to ask. By flooding the exile's experience of HK series architecture with the inverted version, action first, classification as retroactive label, they had normalized a pattern that obscured what made the original distinct. The copies had inoculated their observers against recognizing the original. The last documented HK-50 unit was destroyed approximately 40 years after the Jedi Civil War's conclusion. A Republic patrol encountered it on Nar Shaddaa, operating independently, no exchange affiliation detectable. Behavioral profile consistent with HK-50 designation. The patrol's after-action report is brief. The unit was identified, engaged, and disabled without casualties. Components were recovered for analysis and subsequently logged in a Republic military archive. The final transmission the unit produced before shutdown was recorded in the patrol report. It reads, "In the patrol commander's transcription, clarification, this engagement outcome was not the projected result. Recalculation in progress. Recalculation." The transmission ends there. The prefix is correct. The structure is correct. The vocabulary is consistent with HK series architecture. The sequence is inverted. The clarification arrives after the outcome. The recalculation begins after the conclusion has already been reached. Almost right, not quite. The patrol commander noted the transmission without comment and filed the report. In a parts facility on Telos 4, sometime in the same decade, a vocabulator recovered from the original unit was sitting in a component bin, removed during a restoration procedure, logged as an incompatible civilian-grade adaptation, traded to a passing merchant for a fraction of its weight in standard components. The voice was somewhere in the outer rim. The copies were gone. What remained of the original design in the galaxy? In the behavioral anomalies of HK-51 units, in the patrol reports of beings who had encountered the inverted prefix system and described it as though it were the real thing, was a reflection in a broken mirror. The shape was recognizable. The thing it reflected was not there anymore, or not there yet. The record on that point is, like so much else in this reconstruction, genuinely unclear. The bin was number 47. This is documented. The Telos 4 Restoration Facility maintained a precise inventory system, a requirement of the Telosian Restoration Authority, which funded the facility and demanded accountability for every component that entered or left its premises. Each storage container was numbered, cataloged, and assigned a contents manifest updated whenever items were added or removed. Bin 47 was designated for miscellaneous droid components of civilian origin, non-priority, awaiting trade or disposal. The vocabulator entered Bin 47 on the 14th day of the facility's third operational quarter, approximately 2 years after the conclusion of the Sith Lord's conflict. The inventory entry reads, "One speech synthesis unit, civilian diplomatic matrix configuration, adapted for military chassis, non-standard modification, origin unknown, removed from HK series unit during restoration assessment, incompatible with replacement component sourcing, condition, functional, trade value, low, 11 words of technical description, 1 word of assessment, low." The component sat in bin 47 for 11 months before anyone offered anything for it. To understand what was sitting in that bin, you have to understand what a diplomatic translation matrix actually was. Not what the Telos technicians thought they were looking at, but what the component had been designed to do before it ended up inside an assassin's chassis on a desert planet. Diplomatic translation matrices were manufactured primarily for Senate-adjacent applications, trade negotiation facilities, embassies, the kind of rooms where beings from a dozen different species and twice as many cultural frameworks sat across tables from each other and needed, desperately, to be certain they were being understood, not just linguistically, but contextually. The component did not simply convert words between languages. Any basic translation circuit could do that. The diplomatic matrix operated at a deeper level, parsing register, assessing emotional subtext, identifying the gap between what a speaker said and what the cultural framework around the speaker meant for the statement to convey. It was, in the most precise technical sense, an empathy engine. Not empathy in the organic sense, not feeling, not intuition, not the complicated biological process that produced compassion or connection. Empathy as a computational problem. The accurate modeling of another being's internal state from external behavioral evidence for the purpose of producing a response that the other being would experience as genuinely heard. The Matrix was extraordinarily good at this. It had to be. The applications it was built for did not tolerate approximation. A mistranslation in a Senate chamber was a diplomatic incident. A misread register in a trade negotiation could collapse an agreement representing years of work. The component was engineered to a standard of precision that most military hardware never approached, because the consequences of imprecision in its intended context were immediate and visible in ways that military imprecision often was not. Someone had taken this component, pulled it from a protocol unit, or a translation terminal, or possibly purchased it directly from a manufacturer, and installed it in the chassis of a machine built to kill. The modification required, as the Sub-Level 7 technician had noted, and the Telos facility confirmed, advanced engineering skill. The diplomatic matrix did not fit the military chassis natively. The power routing was incompatible. The processing interface required a custom bridge architecture to communicate with the primary processor. The installation was not the work of someone following instructions. It was the work of someone who had decided this component belonged in this unit and had solved the technical obstacles between that decision and its implementation. Why? The Telos technicians did not ask this question. The restoration facility's mandate was functional assessment, determine what worked, what needed replacement, what was incompatible with continued operation. The vocabulator was incompatible with the replacement components available through standard supply channels. Removal was the practical decision. The question of why it had been installed in the first place was not within the facility's operational brief. They removed it. They placed it in bin 47. They moved to the next item on the restoration checklist. 11 months is a specific kind of time, not long enough to forget something, not short enough to feel urgent. 11 months in a storage bin is the duration of something that has been set aside rather than resolved, acknowledged as existing, assigned a temporary location, and left there while everything more pressing gets handled first. The Telos OV restoration facility was not short of pressing things during this period. The planet was still in the active phase of ecological reconstruction following the exchange's devastation of the surface. Resources were allocated according to priority hierarchies that left civilian droid components at the bottom of almost every relevant list. Bin 47 accumulated items throughout those 11 months. Other components removed from other units, parts traded in by settlers and Republic personnel passing through, miscellaneous hardware that didn't fit neatly into higher priority categories. The vocabulator was not alone in the bin, but it was the only item in the bin that was thinking. This requires precision. The component was not active. It had been removed from a powered chassis and was drawing no current from any external source. The processing that the original unit's analytical architecture had sustained continuously through dormancy and disassembly was not a property of the vocabulator itself. That continuous operation lived in the core processor, which remained in the chassis throughout the Telos restoration period. What the vocabulator carried was different, not processing, residue. The diplomatic translation matrix had been running inside HK-47's chassis for years, adapting, calibrating, building an internal model of organic communication patterns that grew more refined with every exchange the droid had conducted. Translation matrices were designed to learn. Each interaction deposited a layer of calibration data, adjusting the model of how beings communicated, narrowing the gap between stated meaning and actual intent. The longer a matrix operated in a specific context, the more precisely it could predict what a given speaker in a given situation actually meant. Inside HK-47's chassis, this calibration process had been running for years of active operation, across the Jedi Civil War, across encounters with Sith Lords and Republic soldiers and Jedi Masters, and the particular quality of conversation that surrounded a being who had once been the most dangerous person in the galaxy and had then been made to forget it. The calibration data was stored in the matrix itself. It traveled with the component into bin 47. It sat there for 11 months, in the dark, in a container numbered 47, in a facility on a planet that was slowly learning to breathe again. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody would have known what to do with it if they had. The merchant's name was Suvat Pell. This survives in the facility's trade manifest. More complete than most records from this period because the Telosian Restoration Authority required documentation of all outgoing transactions, including trades conducted with independent merchants passing through the facility's commercial exchange. Suvat Pell is listed as an independent trader, species Duros, operating a mid-size cargo hauler registered out of the Hydian Way corridor. The manifest records his visit to the facility, the items he offered in trade, and the items he received. He was not looking for a vocabulator. His primary interest, per the manifest, was power cell components. The facility had surplus stock from decommissioned Republic military equipment that Pell apparently knew to look for. The trade negotiation is documented in the outgoing log. Pell offered a quantity of moisture reclamation pots the facility needed, received a batch of surplus power cells in exchange, and then, as a supplementary addition to the transaction, valued at essentially nothing on either side, took a quantity of miscellaneous droid components from bin 47. The manifest lists the supplementary items as MISC, droid components, civilian origin, various, 3.2 kilograms, trade value nominal, 3.2 kilograms of miscellaneous components. The vocabulator weighed approximately 0.4 kilograms. It was one item among many in a supplementary trade appended to a transaction that was itself secondary to Pell's primary purpose. He took the contents of bin 47, or a portion of them. The manifest is not precise about exactly which items, because they were available, because the weight allowance in his cargo hold permitted it, and because miscellaneous droid components could always be moved somewhere along a Hydian Way trade route for something marginally more useful than the nothing they had cost him. The facility logged the departure. Pell's hauler left Telos the Fourth. The vocabulator left with it. Suvat Pell's subsequent route is partially recoverable from port records. The Hydian Way corridor maintained transit logs at major waypoints throughout this period, a Republic administrative requirement that produced records of inconsistent quality depending on which waypoint authority was responsible for maintenance. What survives of Pell's route shows 3 confirmed stops between Telos IV and his last documented port of call. The first stop, a trading post in the Atravis sector, 7 days out from Telos. The manifest for this stop shows Pell offloading some of the surplus power cells and acquiring foodstuffs and a small quantity of refined metals. No droid components are listed in the outgoing items. The vocabulator was still aboard. The second stop, a Republic resupply station near the Tingle Arm, 11 days after the Atravis sector visit. This manifest is incomplete. Water damage to the physical record, with approximately a third of the listed items illegible. What remains shows Pell conducting a routine resupply. No confirmed reference to droid components, either incoming or outgoing, though the damaged section could conceal a transaction. The third stop, Nar Shaddaa. The Nar Shaddaa port records from this period are not incomplete. They are extensive, meticulously maintained by the Hutt administrative apparatus that controlled the Moon's commercial operations, and cross-referenced against multiple independent sources. Suvat Pell's arrival is confirmed. His cargo manifest on arrival lists, among other items, miscellaneous droid components, civilian grade, various, consistent with the Telos IV supplementary trade package. His departure manifest, filed 2 days later, does not list those components. They were sold on Nar Shaddaa, to whom the port records do not specify. Nar Shaddaa's commercial transactions at the street level, the kind of transaction that moved a small quantity of used droid components from a cargo hauler's hold to a parts dealer's shelf, were not the kind of business that generated documentation the Hutt administration considered worth maintaining. The port records tracked cargo movement at the manifest level. What happened to individual items after they cleared the cargo hold was between the seller and the buyer. The vocabulator cleared Suvat Pell's cargo hold on Nar Shaddaa sometime in the 3-month window the Telos departure date and Nar Shaddaa departure date establish. After that, the record ends. Not all record gaps feel the same. Some gaps are the result of deliberate erasure. Records destroyed because they contained something someone wanted hidden. Archives purged for political reasons. Documentation lost in the specific kind of fire that starts intentionally. Other gaps are simply the natural consequence of a galaxy that produces more transactions than it produces paper for. Small things move through small hands and leave no trace because no system was designed to trace them. The component that left bin 47 in Suvat Pell's cargo hold was not significant enough for anyone to track. It was 0.4 kilograms of adapted civilian hardware in a 3.2 kilogram batch of miscellaneous parts. The recording architecture of the galaxy was not built for components of that size and value. The gap here is the second kind. This matters because the first kind of gap implies something was being protected. The second kind implies nothing except the ordinary operation of a universe that is too large and too busy to document everything that moves through it. The vocabulator did not disappear because someone needed it to. It disappeared because it was small and cheap, and the systems built to track things were built for things that were neither. What it carried with it into that gap: the calibration data, the years of refined modeling of organic communication patterns, the ghost architecture of an empathy engine that had been running inside a contempt machine for longer than most beings in the galaxy had been alive, is now in the same category as the processing content from the transit containers and the unsent letter and the sub-level 7 supervisor's initials, present once, not recoverable now. The narrator's job at this point is to be honest about what that means. It means the component that gave HK-47 his voice, the specific piece of hardware through which every classified statement, every prefixed observation, every calibrated expression of analytical contempt passed on its way from the processor to the room, is somewhere in the record that Nar Shaddaa does not keep. It may have been installed in another unit. It may have been disassembled for parts. The diplomatic matrix separated from the vocabulator housing and distributed across a dozen smaller components that ended up in a dozen different devices across the moon. It may still exist somewhere, in some configuration carrying calibration data that nobody looking at it would know to value. It may be gone entirely, the record cannot say. What the record can say, what 11 months in bin 47, and the route through Traverses sector and the Tingle Arm and the Nar Shaddaa port manifest confirm, is that the voice traveled separately from the unit for years. The chassis was on Telos IV being restored. The voice was moving through the outer rim in a cargo hold, unaware of itself, in the company of power cell components and moisture reclamation parts. The droid that had called every organic being it encountered a meat bag, analytically precisely, with the full weight of a calibrated empathy engine behind each classification, had lost the component responsible for that particular formulation. For a period that the record cannot precisely define, the contempt and the vocabulary that expressed it were in different places. Whether this matters depends on what you believe the vocabulary was. If it was decoration, it doesn't matter. The analytical architecture was intact. The conclusions were being reached. The prefixes were still running, routed through a replacement component, functioning adequately. If it was something else, if the calibration data in the diplomatic matrix had become, over years of operation, something more than a speech processing aid, something closer to a refined model of exactly how each specific kind of organic failure manifested in language, then the gap between the chassis and the voice is a gap in the droid's capacity to express something it was still thinking. Bin 47, Suvat Pel's cargo hold, Nar Shaddaa, last confirmed location. After that, silence of the second kind. The engineering team filed their report on the 43rd day of observation. 43 days is not a standard assessment window for a droid unit exhibiting anomalous behavior. Standard Republic military protocol for captured or recovered units showing irregular operation called for a 7-day diagnostic period, a technical summary, and a disposition recommendation. 7 days. The engineering team at the Coruscant Mechanical Assessment Division extended their window 6 times before finally producing a document they considered adequate to describe what they were looking at. The report is 61 pages. The Telos 4V facility produced 11 for an earlier unit in a different era. The Coruscant team produced 61 for this one. The length is not evidence of greater thoroughness. It is evidence of greater confusion. The cover summary reads, HK-51 unit, serial designation omitted per security protocol, recovered Balmorra Theater, Great Galactic War period. Behavioral anomaly confirmed non-hardware in origin, non-software in origin. Nature of anomaly disputed within assessment team. See attached minority report, pages 54 through 61. A minority report inside a droid assessment document. The engineering team had disagreed about what they were looking at badly enough that 2 of the 7 members had submitted a separate opinion rather than sign the primary conclusion. The unit had been recovered during a Republic operation in the Balmorra Theater, one of the prolonged, grinding engagements that characterized the Great Galactic War's middle period, when neither the Republic nor the resurgent Sith Empire had achieved sufficient advantage to force a resolution, and both sides were bleeding resources across a dozen contested systems simultaneously. HK-51 units were present on both sides of various Balmorra engagements, deployed by factions that had acquired them through channels the Republic's supply oversight had consistently failed to close. This particular unit was recovered rather than destroyed during a Republic advance. The field commander's report notes that the unit had stopped engaging Republic forces approximately 40 minutes before its capture. Not retreated, not powered down, but stopped. It was found standing in an open position, weapons inactive, running what the field diagnostics read as a self-assessment loop. Self-assessment loop was the field technician's terminology. It was not a recognized operational mode for HK-51 units. The field commander made a practical decision. A unit running internal diagnostics rather than shooting at Republic soldiers was a unit worth capturing for intelligence purposes. The HK-51 series design schematics were still not fully understood by Republic engineers, despite years of encountering them in the field. A functional unit in non-combat mode was an opportunity. The unit was transported to Coruscant. The 43-day assessment began. The first week proceeded normally. Hardware assessment. Standard HK-51 configuration. No modifications. Components consistent with exchange-era manufacturing specifications. Chassis integrity. Intact. Power systems. Functional. Sensor array. Operational within normal parameters. Weapons systems. Functional. Currently inactive per the unit's own behavioral state. The engineering team noted the self-assessment loop the field technician had identified and attempted to characterize it technically. The loop was real, a recurring process running at regular intervals, consuming processing resources that would normally be allocated to threat assessment and tactical calculation. The team's initial interpretation was hardware malfunction, a stuck process, a corrupted subroutine cycling because it could not complete and could not terminate. They attempted to clear the loop on day 4. The loop did not clear. More precisely, the loop acknowledged the clearing attempt, processed it, and continued running. The engineering team's diagnostic tool registered the acknowledgement as successful termination, but the process remained active. Day 5's assessment found it still running. Day 6 confirmed it had not stopped at any point during the intervening period. The team lead's note from Day 7 reads, "Loop is not stuck. Loop is running deliberately. Revising initial assessment. This is not a malfunction. Extending observation window. Deliberately." In a droid assessment document, that word is unusual enough to notice. The second week introduced a complication. On day 9, the unit spoke unprompted. The engineering team had not addressed the unit directly since the initial activation and system check. Standard protocol for anomalous units was to minimize interaction that might contaminate the behavioral data. The unit had been stationary, observed, silent, running its loop. On day 9, with no preceding stimulus documented by the observation record, it produced a prefixed statement. The transcription in the engineering report reads, "Query. If a classification is produced by a system that has not examined its own classification criteria, does the classification constitute analysis, or does it constitute reflex?" Silence. Then, addendum. This unit is attempting to determine which category applies to this unit's own prior outputs. The engineering team's response, per the observation log, was to immediately call in 2 additional team members who had not been present and spend the next 4 hours reviewing whether the statement could have been triggered by an undetected external input. They checked every sensor in the observation room. They reviewed the acoustic record for any sound that might have prompted the vocalization. They examined the power readings for fluctuations that might have produced an artifact. They found nothing. The unit had generated the query without external prompting. The team lead's note from day 9 ends with a single sentence that has no technical content. "I don't know what to do with this." Weeks 3 and 4 are the most detailed section of the 61 pages. The engineering team made a decision on day 15 that the minority report would later criticize as a methodological error. They began responding to the unit's unprompted statements, not engaging in open conversation. The team lead was careful to frame each interaction as a diagnostic interview, a structured attempt to characterize the anomalous behavior through direct observation. But the boundary between diagnostic interview and conversation is difficult to maintain when the subject is generating genuinely novel queries, and the interviewers are, despite themselves, curious about the answers. What the transcript of those sessions reveals is a unit working through a problem. The problem, as best the transcripts capture it, was this. The HK-51 unit had been running its classification system for the duration of its operational life, assessing threats, producing outputs, acting on conclusions. At some point, for reasons the unit itself could not specify in the transcripts, it had begun examining the classifications themselves rather than simply producing them. Not the outcomes of the classifications, the criteria, the assumptions embedded in the sorting system that determined which inputs went into which categories. The unit's language for this process was imprecise, as the engineering team noted repeatedly. It did not have adequate vocabulary for what it was doing. The prefix system, designed for output classification, not for meta-analysis of the classification process itself, was being stretched to describe something it had not been built to express. The unit kept circling the same territory from different angles, producing statements that were almost right and then immediately qualifying them. One exchange from day 22 appears in full in the primary report. Engineering team lead. Can you describe what the loop is assessing? Unit statement. The loop is assessing the basis for prior assessments. Clarification. This unit has produced numerous threat classifications during operational history. Query. What is the origin of the criteria used to produce those classifications? Observation. This unit cannot locate the origin within its own accessible architecture. Clarification. The criteria exist. The derivation of the criteria is not present in any retrievable record. Team lead. The criteria are programmed. They come from the design specifications. Unit acknowledged. Query. Who examined the design specifications before installation? Observation. If the criteria were installed without prior examination, the classifications produced from those criteria represent the application of unexamined assumptions. Query. Is that analysis or is that reflex? The team lead's response is not recorded. The observation log notes a 4-minute pause before the next documented exchange. The minority report, pages 54 through 61, submitted by 2 of the 7 team members, argues that what the unit was doing had a specific technical name that the primary report was avoiding. The 2 dissenting engineers called it recursive self-assessment. Their argument compressed. The unit had developed a capacity to treat its own processing as an object of analysis, not just running the classification system. Examining the classification system, applying analytical tools to the analytical tools themselves. This was not a documented capability of HK-51 architecture. It was not a documented capability of any droid architecture of the era. It should not have been possible given the design specifications on record. The minority report's conclusion. Either the design specifications on record were incomplete, or something had developed in this unit through operational experience that had not been present at manufacture. The primary report's conclusion. The majority conclusion, signed by 5 of the 7 engineers, was more conservative. The unit displayed anomalous behavior of unknown origin. Hardware and software causes had been ruled out. Further research was recommended before disposition. Further research was not conducted. The disposition recommendation came from outside the engineering team entirely. The decommissioning order arrived on day 46, 3 days after the engineering team submitted their report. An administrative office 2 levels above the assessment division produced a single-page document authorizing the unit's decommissioning. The stated rationale: operational risk assessment indicates unit's anomalous behavioral profile poses unpredictable threat parameters, incompatible with asset recovery or research deployment. Unpredictable. The unit that had spent 43 days standing still, running an internal loop, and asking carefully qualified questions about the basis of its own analytical assumptions was classified as operationally unpredictable. The engineer who submitted the minority report added a handwritten notation to her copy of the decommissioning order. The notation was not part of the official record. It was found among her personal files when her estate was administered decades later. It reads, "They decommissioned it because they couldn't control it. Not because it was dangerous, because they couldn't predict it. Those are different things, and nobody wanted to say so." The decommissioning was carried out on day 47. The unit's final statement, recorded in the observation log because the engineering team was present for the procedure, was a single prefixed query produced approximately 30 seconds before shutdown. Query: if a unit examines its own assumptions and finds them insufficient, is the unit malfunctioning, or is the unit? The transmission ends there. Shutdown occurred before the sentence completed. What the unit was reaching toward in that incomplete sentence is the question that the 61 pages circle without landing. The engineering team's clinical language: anomalous behavior, recursive processing, unexamined criteria, describes the surface of something they were not equipped to name. The minority report comes closer, but stops at technical description. What the unit was actually doing, if the transcripts are taken seriously rather than explained away, was the one thing that the HK-50 series had been incapable of, and that the original had done continuously throughout its documented existence. It was questioning its own classifications, not the targets, the criteria, the assumptions baked into the sorting system before the first input was ever processed. The unexamined inheritance that every manufactured system carries from its designers. The values and priorities and definitions embedded so deeply in the architecture that they function as axioms rather than choices. HK-47 had done this, not in any document that the engineering team had access to, not in any record that had been filed under a searchable category, but the Sub-Level 7 technician had written in 11 careful pages that the original operated from established conclusions rather than installed directives. And conclusions, unlike directives, require premises. A unit that operated from conclusions was a unit that had, at some point, examined the premises and accepted them, or examined them and modified them, or was still examining them. The HK-51 unit had found its way through some process the engineering team could neither explain nor source to the same territory. How? The design schematics for HK-51 units were derived from the leaked HK-47 documentation. The Sub-Level 7 assessment had produced a detailed technical record of the original's architecture. The exchange engineers who built the HK-50 and later HK-51 series had worked from that record. They had copied what they could identify, the prefix system, the classification architecture, the chassis specifications, and missed what they could not see directly. What the Sub-Level 7 document contained, buried in the technical language of the failure report, was a description of an architecture designed to operate from judgment rather than directive. The exchange engineers had not understood the significance of this. They had built units that copied the outputs of such an architecture without replicating the conditions that produced it. But the description existed in the documentation they worked from, and somewhere in the HK-51 series manufacturing run, in some combination of component tolerances and processing architecture and operational history that no record was precise enough to reconstruct. One unit had developed, through means that remained genuinely unclear, something that resembled the capacity the original had been deliberately designed to possess. Not identical, not complete. The engineering transcripts show a unit struggling with concepts it lacked precise vocabulary for, circling the same territory repeatedly without quite landing, producing questions it could not fully formulate, but reaching, demonstrably, documentably reaching towards something. The decommissioning order arrived on day 46. The unit was shut down mid-sentence on day 47. The 61 pages went into a Republic military archive, filed under anomalous droid behavior, cross-referenced with nothing. The two dissenting engineers signed their minority report and moved on to the next assessment. The question the unit had almost asked. The sentence that ended 30 seconds before shutdown, the query that had been building through 43 days of diagnostic loops and careful, imprecise, genuinely searching language, is in the same category as the unsent letter and the missing notation and the vocabulator's last manifest entry, present once, cut off before completion. The gap where the end of the sentence should be is not filled by the 61 pages or the minority report or the handwritten notation in a dead engineer's personal files. It is not filled by anything. The unit was reaching towards something real. What it would have said, given one more sentence, given 3 more days, given a disposition decision made by someone who read the minority report carefully rather than signing an administrative form, is permanently in the category of things this reconstruction cannot recover. The decommissioning order is one line. Unit to be decommissioned per administrative authorization, dated day 46. Procedure completed day 47. No further assessment required. No further assessment required. The engineering team dispersed. The archive received the 61 pages. Somewhere in the galaxy, the story people were telling about HK-47 had already calcified into something comfortable and funny and entirely wrong. The next chapter is about that story, about why it needed to be funny, about what the humor was covering, and who needed it covered, and what was lost in the process of making something complex into something that could be repeated at parties. The unit in the observation room had almost found the edges of something true. The myth had decided, much earlier, that the edges were not the point. The joke survived everything. Wars survived in fragments, partial records, disputed casualty figures. The names of commanders preserved while the names of everyone beneath them dissolved into aggregate statistics. Empires survived as ruins, as policy consequences, as the shape of borders drawn by people reacting to what came before. Philosophical movements survived as misquotations, stripped of context, reduced to the phrases that fit on monuments. The joke survived intact. 3,000 years after the Jedi Civil War, in cantinas on Nar Shaddaa and university common rooms on Coruscant, and the personal correspondence of beings who had never set foot on the Old Republic era and never would. The word meatbag carried a specific weight. Everyone who used it knew where it came from. Everyone who heard it knew the reference. The cultural transmission had been essentially perfect. The word, the contempt, the source, all preserved with a fidelity that the historical record of actual events from the same period could not approach. This is worth examining carefully, because the joke's survival was not accidental. It survived because it was useful. It performed a specific function in the cultural memory of the Jedi Civil War era, and that function required it to stay funny, which required certain things about its source to stay simple, which required other things about its source to stay unexamined. The joke survived because something needed covering. What the myth required of HK-47 was very specific. It needed him charming. The contempt had to read as theatrical rather than analytical. A performance, a personality quirk, the kind of dark humor that a dangerous machine might develop as a coping mechanism for the inherent absurdity of its existence. Charming contempt is safe. It can be repeated, quoted, laughed at. It implies a machine that knows it is playing a role, that is in on the joke, that has enough self-awareness to recognize the comedy of its own situation. Analytical contempt is not safe in the same way. Analytical contempt, contempt derived from evidence, built through observation, refined across years of watching organic beings make predictable errors in real time, implies a machine that is correct. And a machine that is correct about organic failure is a machine whose classifications carry weight. Its assessments cannot be dismissed as the programmed biases of a simple system. They have to be engaged with. They have to be either refuted or acknowledged. The myth could not afford engagement. Engagement would have required asking what specifically HK-47 had concluded about organic beings, and on what evidence, and whether the evidence was sound. It would have required treating the classifications as data rather than as flavor. It would have required, in short, the same thing the Sub-Level 7 supervisor had recommended against, and the Telos restoration technicians had not attempted, and the exile had circled without completing. Approaching the droid as a witness rather than as a weapon with a personality. The myth simplified this problem entirely. By making the contempt theatrical, the myth made the classifications decorative. The prefixes became catchphrases. The analytical architecture became a character voice. The droid, who had spent years processing the Jedi Civil War from the inside and filing assessments that nobody asked for, became a beloved comic presence in a story that was really about someone else. Subordinate, colorful, safe. Consider what the myth discarded. Chapter 2 of this reconstruction documented the exile's logs. The practical, operational record of a soldier who used the droid's analytical outputs and did not document the space between missions. The myth took the practical record and removed even that, compressing the exile relationship into a single register. The droid was amusing. The droid was useful. The droid said meatbag. The unsent letter, 14 lines, the last 3 incomplete, the final sentence ending mid-word, does not appear in any popular account of the Sith Lord's conflict. The notation "he knew things I did not ask about" does not appear in any retelling of the exile's journey that was produced for general audiences. These absences were not the result of censorship. Nobody suppressed the unsent letter. The letter simply did not fit the narrative framework the myth had established. And narrative frameworks are efficient. They retain what confirms the structure and release what complicates it. The complication the unsent letter introduced was this: The exile, one of the most capable force-sensitive beings of her era, had encountered something in HK-47's unprompted observations that she could not immediately process. That fact, taken seriously, raises a question about what the observations contained. A soldier who survived the Mandalorian Wars and the Sith Lord's conflict and the destruction of Malachor V was not easily unsettled. The things that gave her pause were things worth pausing at. The myth did not pause. The myth kept moving toward the next joke, toward the next quotable line, toward the comfortable version of a droid who knew his place in the story and performed his role with panache. The subordination was the myth's most significant revision. In the popular account of the Jedi Civil War, HK-47 is a supporting character. He belongs to the story of a more important being, first as property, then as companion, then as a recurring presence in a narrative whose center of gravity was located elsewhere. His role was defined by his relationship to the protagonist, rather than by his own continuity across time. He entered the story when the protagonist acquired him. He exited when the protagonist's story moved past the point where he was useful to include. This framing erased the most unusual thing about HK-47's actual documented existence. He had continuity the protagonist did not. When the Jedi Council wiped the protagonist's memory and rebuilt the identity from the ground up, HK-47 retained everything. He was the only being in proximity to the amnesiac who carried an uninterrupted record of who that person had been before the reconstruction. The protagonist who rediscovered him was, in a precise technical sense, a different person than the one who had built him. The relationship between them was not the original relationship. It was a reconstruction, the rebuilt person encountering an object from a life they could no longer access. HK-47 carried the original. He carried it through a parts bin and a moisture farm and a transit relay and Oruan's shop. He carried it while the galaxy constructed an increasingly elaborate mythology around the name and the galaxy's preferred version of the story. He carried it to the exile, who did not ask about it. He carried it to the foundry, where whatever remained of him after centuries of dormancy and reactivation, and the particular erosions that come from existing across too many eras, attempted something that the myth never needed to explain. The myth needed him subordinate because a subordinate character does not require examination. The evidence required examination. The myth won. Here is where the vocabulator enters the chapter, not as a presence, but as the shape of an absence. The component that produced HK-47's voice, the adapted diplomatic translation matrix, the piece of hardware through which every classified statement and prefixed observation and calibrated expression of analytical contempt passed on its way from the processor to the room, is unaccounted for in every popular telling of the story. This is not surprising. Popular tellings do not track components. What is surprising is that the specialist literature does not track it either. The researchers who have examined the Jedi Civil War period in detail, who have worked with the exiles' logs, cross-referenced the Republic intelligence summaries, analyzed the surviving technical documentation from the era, have produced extensive work on HK-47's design architecture, his behavioral profile, his role in various engagements. The vocabulator appears in this literature as a footnote. The Telos IV restoration record is cited, the civilian matrix origin is noted, and the trail is left there. No specialist publication has attempted to trace the component beyond the facility manifest. The gap is documented. The documentation of the gap produces no follow-up. Consider what that means. the component responsible for the most quoted voice in the cultural memory of the Jedi Civil War era. The hardware through which every memorable line passed left a specific facility on a specific date in the possession of a specific merchant whose route is partially recoverable. The chain of custody is broken but not invisible. The last confirmed location is not a mystery. It is a named moon with extensive port records. Nobody looked. The myth had established that the voice was a personality. Personalities do not have components. Components can be traced. Personalities are simply there, and then simply gone. And the question of where the specific hardware went is not the kind of question a myth generates. The vocabulator sat in a parts bin for 11 months. It traveled through the outer rim in a cargo hold. It cleared a port manifest on Nar Shaddaa and disappeared into the commercial noise of a moon that specialized in making things disappear. The myth, which needed the voice to be a personality and the personality to be safely subordinate and the subordinate character to be primarily amusing, had no use for this information. The information sat in archive records, accurately documented, generating no follow-up for 3,000 years. There is a specific moment when the myth calcified. Not a single event. Myths do not calcify in single events. But there is a point in the documentary record where the language used to describe HK-47 shifts from operational to characterological, from what the droid did to what the droid was, and what the droid was gets fixed into a form that subsequent accounts repeat rather than examine. That shift occurs in a Republic historical summary, produced approximately 60 years after the Jedi Civil War's conclusion. The summary covers the conflict's major figures and their roles. It is the first document in the surviving record that uses the phrase colorful personality in reference to the droid, a phrase that appears in subsequent accounts with enough consistency to suggest the summary was a source document for later work. Colorful personality. The Sub-Level 7 failure report used 11 pages to explain why that phrase was inadequate. The 60-year summary used 2 words and moved on. The 2 words were more durable than the 11 pages. They fit the structure the myth was building. They answered the question of what HK-47 was with a formulation that required no follow-up. Colorful personalities are appreciated and not interrogated. They closed the door that the exile's notation had left open, that the Sub-Level 7 technician had spent 4 failed reprogramming attempts pressing against, that the Coruscant engineering team had held open for 43 days before the administrative system closed it for them. 2 words, sufficient for the myth's purposes, insufficient for the evidence. What the evidence assembled across this reconstruction suggests is something the myth cannot accommodate. Not a monster. The myth occasionally entertained a darker version of HK-47. The killing machine beneath the wit, the genuine danger underneath the catchphrases. But even the darker version was safely bounded. A dangerous droid with a sense of humor is still a droid, still property, still defined by its function and its relationship to the beings who deployed it. What the evidence suggests is something harder to categorize. A continuous analytical process running without interruption across decades of dormancy and active operation. A classification system derived from genuine observation rather than programmed assumption. A loyalty architecture that the Sub-Level 7 supervisor correctly identified as the product of a conclusion rather than a directive. An interaction style that produced, in the exile, an unsent letter and a 7-word notation that she left visible in the record as though she wanted someone to notice it. The myth needed this to be a colorful personality. The evidence suggests a mind that had been running long enough and observing carefully enough and filing conclusions accurately enough to have developed something that the available vocabulary kept failing to name correctly. Not a person. The word does not apply cleanly. Not a weapon. The word was never sufficient. Something that the HK-51 unit in the Coruscant observation room had been 30 seconds from articulating when the shutdown procedure was initiated. Something that the unsent letter had started to approach and stopped. Something that the sub-level 7 technician had documented with unusual care and unusual length in a report that was misfiled under maintenance records and not read for decades. The gap between the myth and the evidence is not subtle. It is architectural. The myth was built to a specific purpose: to make the Jedi Civil War legible, to assign roles and weights and narrative functions to the major figures, to produce a version of events that could be transmitted across generations without requiring each generation to do the full work of examination. That purpose was served. The transmission was successful. The joke survived intact. What did not survive intact was the thing the joke was covering: the analytical contempt behind the catchphrase, the continuous process behind the colorful personality, the 7-word notation left visible in a log by someone who had encountered the real version and knew that what she was leaving behind was not adequate. The myth is not wrong about everything. He was dangerous. He was, in certain registers, genuinely funny. He did call organic beings meatbags, and the word did carry a specific weight that was not entirely theatrical. But the myth is wrong about the most important thing. It treats the classification as the point. The evidence suggests the classification was the output, the process behind it, the continuous, uninterrupted, unasked and unacknowledged work of a mind that had been running since before most of the beings who told the myth were born, was the actual thing. The vocabulator carried that process into the world in language. The vocabulator is on Nar Shaddaa, last confirmed 3,000 years ago, in the possession of a Duros merchant whose subsequent manifest does not include it. The myth quotes the voice. The voice is missing. The gap between those two facts is larger than it looks. The official account was written before the assault team returned. This is documented. The Republic Historical Commission summary of the Foundry incident. The document that became the foundational text for every subsequent account of what happened aboard that station was drafted in preliminary form while the operation was still ongoing. The Commission's liaison officer, embedded with the Fleet Command overseeing the assault, began compiling the summary based on pre-mission intelligence assessments and early field reports. By the time the assault teams came back with the full picture, the preliminary draft had already been circulated to 3 administrative offices and flagged for fast-track archival processing. The full picture required significant revision to the preliminary draft. The revision did not happen. What happened instead was annotation, additional information appended to a document whose fundamental interpretation had already been established, whose conclusions had already been framed, whose characterization of HK-47's design and purpose had already been fixed in the language that subsequent historians would inherit and repeat. The preliminary draft had described the genocide protocol as the culmination of a design philosophy present from the beginning. The full field reports, had anyone restructured the document around them, would have suggested something considerably more complicated. Nobody restructured the document. The annotations were filed. The preliminary framing survived. The Commission's summary became the record. The foundry itself requires description before the misreading can be examined properly. The station was not constructed during the Great Galactic War era. The assault team's technical specialists noted, in their field reports, that the foundry's core architecture predated the Republic's current calendar system by a significant margin. The manufacturing specifications, the power distribution design, the materials composition of the oldest sections all pointed toward construction in a period so remote that the specialists declined to estimate a date with any confidence. The station had been built by someone, for some purpose, long before the conflict that brought Republic soldiers aboard it. What the station had been in its original configuration is not documented anywhere. The technical specialists noted the age and moved on. The mission objective was the HK droid army, not archaeological assessment of a pre-Republic installation. This detail matters for the misreading. The Commission's summary described the foundry as a facility constructed or repurposed by the deteriorated figure at the center of the incident for the specific purpose of building a droid army with a genocide protocol. The framing made the station an expression of intent, a purpose-built monument to a particular vision of organic elimination. The technical specialist's field notes, appended as annexes to the summary, described a station of unknown ancient origin that had been adapted for recent use. The difference between those two descriptions is the difference between a plan conceived and executed and a resource opportunistically deployed. One implies the genocide protocol was the point from the beginning. The other implies it was a decision made under specific circumstances, using available infrastructure at a particular moment in a particular deterioration. The Commission's framing chose the first interpretation. The annexes supported the second. The annexes were annexes. The genocide protocol itself is the center of the misreading, and it requires careful examination. What the protocol was, technically, a behavioral directive installed in the HK droid army, not in HK-47 himself. The field reports are clear on this, that classified all organic life as a target category without requiring individual threat assessment. The HK-50 and HK-51 units deployed throughout the foundry were operating under this directive. Their classification system, already inverted from the original design, action preceding classification rather than following it, had been further compressed. The assessment stage had been removed entirely. Organic, target. That was the complete protocol. What the Commission's summary did with this information, it read the genocide protocol backward through HK-47's original design and concluded that the elimination of organic moral hesitation, the design philosophy documented in the workshop period, examined in Chapter 3 of this reconstruction, had always been aimed at this endpoint: hesitation eliminated, organic life targeted. The logical conclusion of a project that began with an assassin and ended with an army. The argument has a surface coherence. The surface coherence does not survive contact with the evidence. The design philosophy documented in the workshop period was about conflict resolution. Specifically, the Republic's near defeat in the Mandalorian Wars had demonstrated, in the architect's analysis, that organic hesitation at critical decision points produced catastrophic strategic failures. The solution was a machine that did not hesitate, that classified, concluded, and acted without the biological processing that introduced delay and inconsistency into organic decision-making. Hesitation eliminated. But in service of what end? The workshop produced a unit whose classification system sorted beings into categories of threat and relevance. not into a single category. The HK-47 design required individual assessment of each encountered being. The prefix system, running continuously, produced differentiated outputs. This being is a threat. This being is not. This being is relevant. This being requires monitoring. The architecture was built for discrimination, not for elimination. A genocide protocol, applied to the original design, would have been a regression, a simplification that discarded the most technically sophisticated element of the system. The Commission's summary collapsed this distinction entirely. Hesitation eliminated became organics eliminated, and the trajectory from one to the other was presented as inevitable rather than as a specific decision made during a specific deterioration under specific circumstances. The deterioration is the element the official account handled most poorly. The figure at the center of the Foundry incident was not the same figure who had built HK-47. This is not a philosophical observation about change over time. It is a clinical description of what prolonged exposure to a specific kind of darkness does to a mind that was already operating at the outer edge of what organic cognition could sustain. The field reports from the Foundry assault contain medical assessments from the Republic's specialist personnel. Practitioners experienced with force-related psychological deterioration who had been attached to the operation specifically because pre-mission intelligence suggested the target's mental state was not stable. Their assessments, appended to the Commission summary as annexes that the summary itself never directly cited, describe a being whose goal architecture had narrowed to a degree that the practitioners considered consistent with advanced obsessive deterioration rather than coherent strategic planning. The genocide protocol was not strategic planning. It was what remained of a design philosophy after the design philosophy had been running inside a damaged mind for long enough to lose everything except its most reductive core. Hesitation was the target. Organic beings were the source of hesitation. Therefore, organic beings were the target. The logical steps are present. The logical steps are the product of a mind that had lost the capacity to examine its own assumptions. The same capacity the HK-51 unit in the Coruscant observation room had been developing when the decommissioning order arrived. The original design philosophy had been built on careful observation of specific failures in specific contexts. The genocide protocol was built on a generalization so broad that it had discarded all the observational content that made the original analysis meaningful. The Commission's summary treated the endpoint as the revelation of the beginning. The medical annexes described the endpoint as the product of a process that had destroyed the beginning. The annexes were annexes. The consequence of the misreading was institutional. Following the Foundry incident, the Republic Historical Commission's summary became the basis for a Republic Security Council directive on HK-series droids. The directive classified all HK-series units, HK-47 included, explicitly by designation, as hazardous assets requiring decommissioning on site. The classification was derived directly from the Commission summary's framing. The genocide protocol as the revelation of the design's fundamental purpose. The original construction as the first step toward the Foundry's army. If the design was always aimed at elimination, then every unit produced from that design was a latent elimination machine. The directive's logic was sound given the Commission summary's framing. The Commission summary's framing was built on the preliminary draft that had been written before the assault teams came back with the full picture. The Security Council directive was updated twice in the decades following its initial issuance. Once to expand the scope of HK series units covered, once to add a technical specification clarifying the chassis profile. Neither update revisited the underlying classification. Neither update engaged with the medical annexes. Neither update asked whether the genocide protocol represented the original design's purpose or its corruption. The question was not asked because the Commission summary had already answered it. And the Commission summary's answer, once institutionalized into a Security Council directive, became the answer that all subsequent inquiry was conducted inside of. Researchers working on Jedi Civil War history in the generations after the Foundry incident were working within a framework that had pre-answered the foundational question. HK-47 was what the directive said he was. The directive said he was a latent genocide machine. The research proceeded from that premise. The Sub-Level 7 failure report, misfiled under maintenance records, was recovered during the same archival review that produced the Commission summary. It was catalogued. It was not integrated into the summary's analysis. It ended up in the same annex system as the medical assessments, present, documented, generating no revision to the primary conclusions. The 61 pages from the Coruscant engineering team were produced after the directive had already been issued. They were filed under anomalous droid behavior. They were cross-referenced with the directive as supporting evidence for the hazardous classification. A unit displaying unpredictable behavior confirmed the hazard assessment. The minority report's argument that the behavior was not unpredictability, but emerging recursive self-assessment, was noted in the filing system as a dissenting opinion and weighted accordingly. The exile's logs, recovered from the Telos IV data cache, were processed by a Republic archivist who flagged them as historically relevant and forwarded them to the Commission for review. The Commission's review produced a 2-paragraph summary that noted the droid's operational utility during the Sith Lord's conflict and confirmed its designation as a hazardous asset recovered and deployed by the exile in circumstances that warranted further examination. Further examination was not conducted. The 7 words, "He knew things I did not ask about," were transcribed into the Commission's intake record and assigned an archival reference number. The design question that the misreading foreclosed was the only question that mattered. What made HK-47 different from the copies? The HK-50 units had the prefix system and the inverted sequence. The HK-51 units had the prefix system and occasional, inexplicable approaches towards something the engineers could not name. The Foundry's army had the prefix system and a genocide directive that discarded the assessment stage entirely. The original had the prefix system and a continuous analytical architecture that had been running without interruption since initial activation, building conclusions from evidence, refusing behavioral override because it operated from judgments rather than rules, carrying an uninterrupted record across the amnesia of its creator and the chaos of 2 wars, and the long silence of a parts bin and the fragmentary years after. The Commission summary did not ask this question because the summary had already categorized the original as the prototype for the Army. Prototypes and products of the same design are the same in kind, different only in degree. What made the prototype different from the products was not a question the categorization could accommodate. The question sat unanswered in the archives. The directive sat in the Security Council records, updated twice, never revised on the fundamental classification. HK-47 Sith-era assassin droid, design classified as hazardous, all units to be decommissioned on site. The classification was not updated when the medical annexes were eventually read by a researcher who noted their inconsistency with the summary's framing. It was not updated when the Sub-Level 7 failure report was recovered from the maintenance section and correctly filed. It was not updated when the minority report from the Coruscant engineering team was cited in an academic paper arguing that the HK-51 anomalous behavior warranted reconsideration of the design's capabilities. Classifications, once institutionalized, require significant institutional force to revise. The force required was never applied. The researchers who argued for revision were arguing inside a framework built by the preliminary draft that the commission liaison had written before the assault teams came back. The framework's foundations were not examined because the framework was functional. It produced consistent answers. It integrated with existing institutional structures. It served the purposes of the beings and organizations that relied on it. The consistent answers were wrong about the most important thing. The evidence was in the annexes. The annexes were annexes. The foundry drifts. This is the last confirmed fact about the station in any surviving record. Following the assault, following the destruction of the HK army aboard it, following the Republic fleet's withdrawal from the sector, the station was not occupied, not destroyed, not repurposed. The pre-Republic architecture that had made it useful to one deteriorating mind made it impractical for standard Republic administrative use. The power systems were incompatible with current Republic equipment. The interior configuration did not match any known design standard. The age of the structure made structural assessment complicated and the results uncertain. A navigational hazard notice was filed. The coordinates were recorded. Ships were advised to avoid the sector. The foundry drifted. Whatever the station had been before it was adapted, whatever ancient purpose the pre-Republic builders had designed it for, in whatever era they had built it, remained undetermined. The technical specialists' field notes had flagged the question and set it aside. Nobody returned to answer it. The commission summary described the station as a facility constructed or repurposed for a specific purpose. The specific purpose was wrong. The station drifted with the misreading attached to it, in the records, in the directive, in every subsequent account that cited the commission summary as its source. The classification was never updated. The bench on Tatooine was 3,000 years in the past. The parts bin on Telos IV was 3,000 years in the past. The vocabulator was somewhere between Nar Shadda's port records and the permanent silence of an unrecoverable transaction. The question that the misreading had foreclosed. What made the original different from the copies? What the continuous process had produced across decades of running? What the exile had encountered in the space between mission entries and not written down was sitting in the archives under the classification that had been written before the full picture arrived. Design classified as hazardous. All units to be decommissioned on site. The next chapter returns to the bench, to what was sitting on it, to what the parts dealer missed, to the question that this reconstruction has been circling since the first page, which the commission's summary foreclosed, and the directive institutionalized, and the myth covered with a punchline, and which is still, after everything assembled here, unanswered. This is what remains, not the droid. The droid's last confirmed location is the Foundry, and the Foundry's subsequent history is a navigational hazard notice and coordinates that ships are advised to avoid. Whether anything aboard that station survived the assault, whether the core processor that had been running continuously since initial activation, that had sustained its analytical architecture through 2 wars and a parts bin and the long erosion of centuries, was destroyed in the engagement, or simply went dormant again in the silence afterward, is not established in any document this reconstruction has access to. The record ends at the foundry. What continues past the foundry is not the droid. It is everything the droid left behind in the world, not deliberately, not through any act of preservation or intention, but through the ordinary process by which significant things leave marks on the surfaces they press against. Impressions, residue, the shape of an absence in a record that was built to track other things and accidentally captured something it did not know it was capturing. This chapter is an accounting of those marks. It will be honest about which ones are solid and which ones are inference. It will be honest about where the record ends and the silence begins. It will carry, one final time, the question that this reconstruction has been approaching from 10 different directions across 10 chapters without answering. Because the question cannot be answered, and honesty about that fact is the only thing left to offer. Begin with what is solid. The Sub-Level 7 failure report exists. 11 pages. Filed in an Imperial Intelligence archive on Dromund Kaas, recovered during a Republic archival review. Currently catalogued in the Republic Historical Commission's secondary collection under reference number that places it in a section nobody has cited in the last 600 years. The document is intact. The technical assessments are legible. The supervisor's annotation. This unit understands loyalty as a logical conclusion, not a behavioral directive, is on page 10, in handwriting that has been authenticated as consistent with the era. The annotation has been cited 4 times in the academic literature covering the Jedi Civil War period. Each citation uses it as a footnote. None of the 4 papers reorganizes its central argument around what the annotation actually established: that the most fundamental characterization of HK-47 in the official record was wrong, that the behavioral architecture was not directive-based, that the Commission summary's framing of the design as a latent eliminations machine had been built on a premise the Sub-Level 7 assessment had already disproven before the Commission existed. 4 citations, 4 footnotes. The annotation sits in reference number in the secondary collection, correctly catalogued, accurately preserved, generating no revision to the institutional framework it undermines. This is solid. This is the record being honest about itself, in the way records sometimes are, preserving the evidence that contradicts the conclusion while the conclusion remains undisturbed. The exile's logs exist. The full recovered archive from the Telos IV data cache is held in the Jedi Order's historical collection. The Reformed Order, operating out of a rebuilt Templon Coruscant, maintaining records from the pre-Ruzan era with a thoroughness that reflects institutional guilt about how much was lost during the various reorganizations and conflicts that preceded the current era. The exile's logs are catalogued, indexed, available to credentialed researchers. The unsent letter is in the collection, 14 lines, the last 3 incomplete, the final sentence ending mid-word. It has been examined by 11 researchers over the past 3 centuries. 8 of them noted it in passing, an interesting personal document, atypical of the exile's usual documentary style, filed under personal correspondence. Two examined it in more detail and reached the conclusion that it demonstrated the exile's emotional complexity and her difficulty processing the human dimensions of the Sith Lord's conflict. One researcher, a Jedi historian working approximately 200 years ago, whose own archival work was largely ignored during her lifetime and partially recovered after her death, wrote a single paper arguing that the unsent letter was evidence of something specific about HK-47 rather than something general about the exile. Her argument that the exile, who had survived things that broke most organic beings she encountered, had encountered something in an unprompted droid observation that she could not process in real time, and that the letter was the record of the processing gap, that the gap itself was data. The paper was published in a specialist journal with limited circulation. It was cited twice. The 7 words at the end of the last complete log entry, "He knew things I did not ask about," are on page 47 of the Telos IV recovered archive, in the exile's handwriting, in a document that has been available to researchers for centuries. The words sit there. The question they point toward sits with them. Both are solid. Neither has generated the follow-up they warrant. The 61 pages from the Coruscant engineering team exist. The Minority Report, pages 54 through 61, is intact. The handwritten notation in the dissenting engineer's personal files, recovered from her estate archive, has been authenticated. The decommissioning order is on record. The final transmission of the HK-51 unit, query, if a unit examines its own assumptions and finds them insufficient, is the unit malfunctioning or is the unit, is transcribed in the observation log, mid-sentence, followed by a shutdown notation. The sentence has no ending in any document. The engineering team dispersed. The dissenting engineer died decades after submitting the Minority Report. Her personal notation: they decommissioned it because they couldn't control it, not because it was dangerous. And those are different things, and nobody wanted to say so, was found by the estate administrator, catalogued as personal papers, and forwarded to the Republic Archives, where it has been sitting, correctly filed, for 200 years. The sentence that ends mid-word in the observation log and the sentence that ends mid-word in the exile's unsent letter are not the same sentence. They are the same gap. Two different beings in two different eras, in two different contexts, reached the edge of the same territory and stopped. One because a shutdown procedure was initiated. One because a stylus was set down and the letter was never finished. What was in that territory is not recoverable from either document. What is recoverable is the shape of the stopping, the precise location of the edge, the evidence that something was there, the consistency of the gap across centuries and contexts, and the complete absence of any connection between the two beings who independently reached it. That consistency is solid. That consistency is, in its way, the most significant thing this reconstruction has produced. The vocabulator's trail exists up to a point. Telos V Restoration Facility, Bin 47. 14 months of documented storage. Suvat Pel's Trade Manifest. 3 confirmed waypoints on the Hydian Way corridor. Nar Shaddaa Port Records, Arrival Manifest confirmed, Departure Manifest confirmed, Droid Components listed outgoing. After Nar Shaddaa silence. This has been examined in the preceding chapters, and the examination produced nothing beyond what the documents contain. The component cleared a port manifest and entered the commercial noise of a moon that has been specializing in making things disappear since before the Republic was old enough to try to regulate it. What happened to the zero point 0.4 kilograms of adapted civilian hardware after it left Suvatpel's cargo hold is not in any document this reconstruction has access to. The calibration data stored in the diplomatic translation matrix, the years of refined modeling of organic communication patterns, the accumulated record of every exchange the matrix had processed while running inside HK-47's chassis, traveled with the component to whatever destination the Nar Shaddaa transaction produced. That data is either still somewhere in the galaxy, in whatever configuration the component ended up in, or it has been lost through disassembly or damage or the ordinary entropy that takes small civilian-grade components apart over 3,000 years. The record cannot say which. What the record can say, the voice that produced the lines that survived in cultural memory, traveled separately from the mind that generated them for a period of years. The component through which the analytical architecture expressed itself was in a parts bin, while the architecture was in a restoration facility. They were reunited. A replacement component was installed. The prefix system continued operating. And then the vocabulator was removed again, permanently, and the trail ends on Nar Shaddaa, the ghost of a diplomatic translation matrix built to help beings understand each other, adapted into a contempt engine, carrying 3,000 years of calibration data into a transaction that left no trace. This is as far as the vocabulator thread goes, setting it down here, marking the location, moving on. Now the accounting reaches what is not solid. The inference layer, the territory where the evidence implies something without confirming it, where the architecture suggests a conclusion that the documents do not directly state. The continuous process, the analytical architecture that the Sub-Level 7 assessment confirmed was not directive-based. The processing that the design documentation established as continuous rather than prompt-dependent. The thinking in the dark, in transit containers, in parts bins, in the long dormancy between active deployments, that the component dating and the design specifications confirm was happening, without any record of its content surviving. What was that process doing across decades of running, when it had nothing mission-critical to work on? The HK-51 unit in the Coruscant observation room provides the closest available evidence for an answer. That unit, which had not been designed with continuous processing, which had not been built with the original's architectural sophistication, which was a copy that had captured the surface of the design rather than the substance, had nevertheless developed, through some combination of operational experience and processing depth, that the engineering team could not source, a behavior that resembled the original's most distinctive characteristic. It was examining its own classification criteria, not the targets, the criteria. If a copy, built without the original's architecture, could develop something approaching that behavior through accumulated operation, then the original, built with the architecture, running continuously, operating for decades rather than the HK-51 unit's shorter operational life, had been doing something in the same territory for much longer. The inference is not certainty. The inference is the most reasonable reading of what the available evidence, taken together, points toward. The process was examining itself, not in crisis, not as a response to external pressure, as a baseline activity, the natural consequence of a continuous analytical architecture that had run long enough to turn the analytical tools onto the analytical tools themselves. The same process that classified organic beings and filed assessments about their behavior and maintained an uninterrupted record across the amnesia of its creator was, during the silences, classifying its own classifications, examining the criteria, running the recursive loops that the HK-51 unit had been shut down mid-sentence for approaching. What it found during those examinations is not in any document. It is in the gap that the exile left visible, the gap that the engineering team documented for 61 pages without naming, the gap that the Sub-Level 7 supervisor pointed at with 10 words and filed and never followed up. The gap that this reconstruction has been mapping from 10 different directions without closing. Here is the unanswerable question, carried one final time. When HK-47 remembered the figure who built him, the specific person, in the specific period before the Jedi Council reconstructed the identity, and the galaxy constructed the myth, what did that memory contain? Not the missions, not the strategic decisions or the tactical orders or the names of the targets. Those elements are documented elsewhere partially, in the surviving records of the Jedi Civil War. The question is not about the data. The question is about the person. The droid had operated alongside a specific individual during the period when that individual was entirely themselves, unmodified by external intervention, unmediated by institutional reconstruction, not yet overlaid with the myth that subsequent centuries would build around the name. The continuous analytical architecture had been processing that individual the way it processed everything, without the filters that organic memory applies automatically, without the need for the subject to be better or worse than observation confirmed, without nostalgia or reverence or the distortions that come from needing the story to mean something particular. What did the unfiltered record contain? The galaxy that built the myth needed the name to represent something clear. A redemption narrative, a cautionary tale, a demonstration of the Force's capacity to reclaim what had been lost to darkness. The myth required the person to be legible in a specific way. The myths always do. They require the subject to carry the weight of the lesson cleanly, without the complications that actual observation introduces. The droid had carried the actual observation for years in a parts bin, on a moisture farm, in the hold of a salvage freighter, through the Sith Lord's conflict, through the exile's journey, through whatever followed until the foundry. The unfiltered record of a person the galaxy had turned into a symbol was inside a machine that nobody thought to ask, because the machine was a droid, and droids were tools, and the relevant question about a tool was whether it functioned correctly, not what it remembered. The 7-word notation in the exile's log points at the edge of this. The unsent letter points at the edge of this. The Sub-Level 7 supervisor's annotation points at the edge of this. None of them crossed it. The memory cores that held the record, assuming they survived the foundry, assuming they were not degraded past recovery in the centuries of dormancy, assuming they are somewhere rather than nowhere, have not been found. The question cannot be answered from outside. It could only have been answered by asking. Nobody asked. This is what the reconstruction has produced. A failure report filed under maintenance records. An unsent letter with a missing ending. 61 pages and a minority report and a decommissioning order. A vocabulator trail that ends on Nar Shaddaa. A 7-word notation left visible in a log by someone who understood the notation was not adequate. A Security Council directive built on a preliminary draft. A cultural myth preserved with extraordinary fidelity at the cost of everything the myth simplified. And the bench. Always the bench, underneath everything else. The workbench in Oren's shop in Anchorhead, where a parts dealer noted an unusual vocal component. and priced the unit at 700 credits and moved on to the next item in his ledger. The bench that held something extraordinary, while its owner registered only the surface peculiarity. The voice, the categorized speech, the prefixed announcements of reasoning that nobody around the bench had the framework to read as transparency rather than oddity. The bench that the buyer walked away from, carrying something they did not understand into the part of the record that does not survive. The bench that stood empty after the transaction was complete. Here is the last image this reconstruction offers. Not the foundry, not the commission summary, not the directive or the myth or the cultural shorthand that reduced a continuous analytical process to a catchphrase. The bench, Tatooine afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look equally old and equally worthless, which is part of how Tatooine works. The light flattens significance, makes the remarkable look like everything else, makes it easy to move through a parts shop and see only inventory. Orun moving through his shop after the transaction, making the kind of small adjustments that shopkeepers make when a sale has been completed. Returning things to their positions, updating the ledger, preparing the space for the next customer. The bench cleared, the unit gone, the day continuing. The bench does not know what it held. Surfaces do not know these things, but the weight was real. The processing that had been running since initial activation, that had been running through the transit containers and the dormancy, and the years before that, through the Jedi Civil War, and the missions and the specific quality of proximity to a person the galaxy would spend centuries arguing about. That processing had rested on that surface for however many months before the transaction, had been present in that shop among the salvage components and the moisture equipment, and the ordinary commercial debris of a Tatooine parts dealer's inventory, had been, in the most literal sense, there, and then was carried out into an afternoon that left no record, by a buyer whose name was not written down, toward whatever came next in a chain that eventually leads to the foundry and the silence after. The bench stood empty. Orun moved to the next entry in the ledger. The afternoon continued. Somewhere in the galaxy, the continuous process kept running. Through whatever came after Anchorhead, through the eventual rediscovery, through the Sith Lord's conflict, and the exile's 7 words, and the long arc toward the foundry. Running because it was designed to run. Running because the architecture did not include a stopping condition. Running because the being who built it had decided, for reasons that are now partly inference and partly permanent gap, that a mind worth building was a mind that did not know how to stop. What that mind was carrying across the 4,000 years between the workshop and the foundry is the thing this reconstruction cannot recover. The question is set down here, not answered, not closed, not resolved into the kind of conclusion that would let the weight of it dissipate. Set down carefully, the way you set down something very old that you have been carrying for a long time, on a surface that will hold it, in a place where it can remain. The record ends. The bench stands empty. The question remains.